Imagine you just got your license to drive, and your very first car. School's out for spring break, so you're headed on a little daycation beach trip with your best friend. The sun, the sand, and well, the unexpected evil that's lurking in broad daylight. High school students Megan Carr and Cherish DeSantis had no idea the short trip would be their last. Sometimes that's just the way it is. Not everyone had the type of lifestyle where they were taking a bunch of photos, and their stories don't get as much attention as others. Therefore, there are not as many pictures online, but just let your imagination guide you because this story is too insane not to tell. Let's get into the story for today. We will be beginning this case in Thomasville, Georgia, in the spring of 1992, where two best friends are in their junior year of high school at Thomasville High, Megan Carr and Cherish DeSantis. They were probably destined to be best friends because they were born only one day apart in 1975. They had been lifelong friends since childhood and were inseparable. Cherish Fountain DeSantis, who friends called Sherry, was born on August 29, 1975 in Thomasville, Georgia, to Peter Angel DeSantis Jr., known as Pete, and Hazel Stapleton DeSantis, who went by the nickname Dot. Cherish was born with beautiful natural red hair, which would become a very prominent feature throughout her life. Her best friend Megan Marie Carr was born, like I said, just one day later on August 30th, 1975, also in Thomasville, Georgia, to John Clark Carr and Shirley Singletary Carr. She had one older brother, John Clark Jr., who was 6 years older than her. Thomasville, Georgia, well, let me tell you about this place. It had a population of about 17,000 people in 1992. It's that little tiny red dot on this map, only about 35 miles from the Florida state line. Thomasville is known as Georgia's Rose City. They showcase nearly 2,000 different blooms at the Rose Show and Festival every year. It's a quaint, unique little town filled with charming boutiques, cafes, and southern hospitality. So what's it like growing up in a town like Thomasville? Well, it can vary depending upon your status, that's for sure. Both Megan and Cherish's families were well off. Megan's dad, John, owned and operated a water well drilling company that had been in the family since the 1940s. It's estimated that his company made around $2 million a year, so they were definitely living a very comfortable lifestyle. By 1992, Megan's parents were divorced, so she was living with her mom, Shirley. As for Cherish's dad, he was very well known in Georgia and internationally. Pete DeSantis grew up in Thomasville as well. He attended Thomas County Central High School, but then he went on to graduate from John Marshall Law School in Atlanta, Georgia, where he obtained his law degree. After that, Pete got into the tobacco business. He was a world-renowned tobacco auctioneer and had auctioned tobacco for more than 30 years. He opened and owned DeSantis Auction Company in 1981, and Auctioneer Training Center Incorporated, where he actually trained other people on how to become auctioneers. He was a member of the National Auctioneer Association, and Pete had been appointed by numerous governors to the Georgia State Auctioneer Commission. On a number of occasions, he was also named the National Auctioneer of the Year in the tobacco industry. I don't know how you feel about that, but this is how he made a living. These types of tobacco auctions are almost a thing of the past, considering the tobacco industry saw such a decline in smokers since people became educated about the dangers of cigarette smoking. But it was still a very booming business back in the 80s and early 90s. Once Pete had made a significant income, he got into real estate and owned many other properties between Georgia and Florida. The home that the DeSantis family lived in, out in Thomasville, was in a very rural area. It was tucked away from everyone else, in a location called Olive Creek. It's so private, I was able to find a home that would most likely have been similar to the one the DeSantis family lived in. This isn't their home, but it's one in the same neighborhood. Also 4 bedrooms and 4 baths, and over 3,000 square feet, just like the one Cherish's dad owned. As you can see, it's very nice. This area actually reminds me a lot of the one the Murdaugh family lived in, out in Moselle. Very private. The DeSantis family lived on almost 8 acres of land, but it was only a 15-minute drive away from Thomasville High School. Because they were living in a small town, I'm not sure how Cherish and Megan met, probably from going to the same schools, but they did have very similar lifestyles and could have met in clubs they were a part of. I don't know which ones they were in as kids, but by high school both of them participated in Sub-Deb and Tri-Hi-Y. Sub-Deb stands for sub-debutante, and this means a woman is not yet a debutante, but is on her way to becoming one. A debutante is a young woman of an aristocratic or upper-class family who has reached maturity and is presented to society or to eligible men. Yes, it's their formal debut. Considering both girls participated in this elite club as teens, maybe they met in similar ones as children. Sub-debs are basically high school sororities, and its members were very involved in social activities. Many of the girls who participated were seen as smart, beautiful, well-dressed, wealthy, and from some of the most well-known families in the area. So it's no surprise Megan and Cherish became so close. They also participated in Tri-Hi-Y, as I mentioned earlier, which is part of the YMCA program and has been active with young adults since 1850. The Hi stands for high school, and the Y stands for YMCA. The YMCA, if you don't know, was originally only for men, the Young Men's Christian Association, but eventually the Tri-Hi-Y clubs were later formed for girls. The Tri was for their purpose being threefold: to create, maintain, and extend, to the fullest capacity of one's ability throughout the home, school, and community, high standards of moral character through improvement, brotherhood and sisterhood, equality and service in high schools. Megan and Cherish were very popular. They were part of the cool kids on campus, and both were 16 in 1992. Cherish had a long-term and serious boyfriend at the time. His name was Alex Hunt, and they were very close. They would do what typical teens their age would: drive fast in their cars, listen to music, and get into a little trouble. But, all in all, they were good kids. Megan's mom, Shirley, was a little stricter, maybe since she was raising Megan all on her own, but she would definitely make sure her daughter was in line. As long as she was getting good grades and doing her chores, Megan was allowed to partake in extracurricular activities. Her favorite thing to do was perform with her color guard team. They did choreographed dances and routines for the school marching band. They're usually seen flipping flags in the air. Cherish was a cheerleader. They were both part of the drama troupe together. The Thomasville High School juniors and BFFs were attached at the hip. Whenever you saw one, you saw the other. Megan and Cherish would walk the halls of their high school together every day, and their assistant principal, Mr. Andy Jones, always tried to find a way to make them laugh or smile. It wasn't hard to do, as the girls loved to have fun. They were especially excited for spring break. Their last day of school was Thursday, March 26th, and the following day, Friday, was a teacher planning day, meaning no classes. After that, they had time off until April 6th for spring break. The first thing on their agenda: getting some sun at the beach. Of course, not in Thomasville, but across the state border in Florida. It was customary for Thomasville students to head to Tallahassee, Florida, and take State Road US 98 about 80 miles to the shore. The trip was only about 2 hours long, and the drive itself was fun with plenty to do along the way. One beach, in particular, was popular with teenagers from Thomasville. It wasn't overrun by tourists and was called Bald Point. This 8-mile stretch of shoreline on Alligator Point Peninsula along the Gulf of Mexico was part of Bald Point State Park. The park is known for its picturesque scenic areas, including coastal marshes, pine flatwoods, and oak thickets. It's a popular spot for bird and wildlife viewing, and yes, there are alligators there, hence the name Alligator Point. But why Bald Point? Because each fall, bald eagles migrate south to this area. When I think of a beach day, it's not exactly what I imagine, but the beaches there are still beautiful. The park is open from sunrise to sunset, offering picnic areas, restrooms, and a boardwalk to enjoy the marsh's sights and sounds as you head toward the beach. Once there, it's just water and sand as far as the eye can see. There are some homes in the Alligator Point community, but they are few and far between. That was the plan for Megan and Cherish, to set off Friday morning around 10, and spend the day at Bald Point. The night before, they had a sleepover watching movies together. By morning, they packed their beach bags with bikinis and fit lip-flops, ready to head to Florida. They planned to return home that same evening. A couple of their friends were supposed to join, but one had to babysit, and the other changed her mind at the last minute, so it was just Megan and Cherish. Megan was driving her black, late-model Honda. Along the way, they made 3 stops. First at a convenience store, possibly for snacks and gas, then at the State Line store for souvenirs, and finally at a sandwich shop before reaching the beach around noon. Megan parked the car, and the girls set up their beach blankets, put on their bikinis, and tuned into a local rock station on their battery-operated boombox as they basked in the sun. There wasn't much to do except swim and suntan, but that's exactly what they came for, a relaxing day at the beach with not a care in the world. A few hours later, an off-duty police officer from Savannah, Georgia, who was vacationing with his wife, was strolling down Bald Point Beach. They saw Megan and Cherish lying in the sun and made sure not to intrude, making a wide sweep around their blanket to give them privacy. This beach, after all, was a quiet, secluded spot, unlike other spring break destinations where tourists might be rude, walking over your blankets or throwing sand on you. On their way back, the couple passed the girls again. That's when the officer's wife noticed something unsettling. The girls hadn't moved at all. They were in the exact same position as before, and one of the girls seemed to be laying on top of the other. It struck them as odd. The officer, sensing something was wrong, told his wife to stay back while he went to check on them. What he saw confirmed his fears. There was blood. Horrified, he screamed to his wife, "We've got to call the police. They're dead." Imagine the shock of stumbling upon such a scene. Even for an officer, it's not something you expect to see at a beach, especially in broad daylight. Bald Point was a family beach where locals would enjoy afternoon picnics or sunset strolls. You don't expect a peaceful day to end in tragedy. The officer and his wife rushed to find a phone to report what they had just witnessed. The Franklin County Sheriff's Officer, Warren Rotenberry, was the first on the scene. He arrived around 3 p.m. He was familiar with Alligator Point since 1966, and he had never witnessed anything like this. There were no problems with women being attacked in this area. Rotenberry, a native of southern Georgia himself, had actually graduated from Thomasville High School, just like the girls, but he wouldn't put that together until later when the pair were identified. He found the two women lying lifeless in broad daylight, with the midday sun now scorching their bodies. He scanned the immediate area, and the radio was still playing rock music, which now seemed very eerie. It created a strange contrast between this tragedy and the carefree atmosphere of the beach. He saw that their belongings were still there. Their beach bags were still on the blanket, which was undisturbed. Megan's car keys were right beside her, within reach. He located their wallets, which contained their IDs as well as cash, so robbery definitely didn't seem like the motive here. The person who did this left the car and cash behind. Both girls were still wearing their bikinis, which were not tugged on, and they weren't torn in any way, so a sexual motive was ruled out. So what happened to these girls? Megan had a towel over her head, which was soaked with blood, and Cherish was lying on top of her with a gunshot wound to her head. There was a lot of blood pooling around both of the bodies at this point, and there didn't seem to be any other marks on them. It didn't look like there was a struggle at all. It was as though they were just caught off guard and didn't see this coming whatsoever. Rotenberry was able to make a preliminary identification of both girls by looking at their IDs and matching them to their bodies. I can't even imagine stumbling upon something like this. He noticed that they were from his hometown, and it got personal for him. What a small world that they were from the same tiny southern town that he was from. He began looking around the area as he lined up transport for the girls' remains to be taken back to the medical examiner's office. He wondered if this was done by someone the girls knew. It didn't seem to make sense that a stranger would do something like this. How would they even know that the girls were here? It also appeared they were killed very close in time to one another. The fact that Cherish fell right on top of Megan signified that they were killed back to back, that she didn't have much time to move very far. It seemed like this had been planned, like someone had followed them from back home. But who would want these two young teenagers dead? Officer Rotenberry called in additional units from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, FDLE, to search the beach and the surrounding area, as well as interview beachgoers and locals to see if they had heard or seen anything out of the ordinary. Even though this was a secluded area of the beach, there were many other families, many other cars parked nearby, and residents who were close enough that they should have been able to hear or see something. There was one guy who said that he was down there every day, a regular to the area, and he said he heard what he thought were fireworks around 12:30 or so that afternoon. Then he saw a car driving nearby, and it was not a car that he's used to seeing. It looked to him to be a blue Chevy Nova or something like that. He said it was a kind of long car, and I wasn't familiar with the style, so I looked it up. This is what it looked like. Officers went to look in the parking lot area, and that's when they discovered Megan's black car parked in one of the designated spots. The Georgia license plate made it apparent this was most likely the car the girls came in. But then they saw something odd. There was a car parked directly behind Megan's car. kind of blocking it in so that they couldn't get out. And there were ample spots for other cars to take. So why would someone choose to park right here, of all places? Could this be the car the man saw? It wasn't a Chevy, but it was blue. So perhaps the guy who said it was a Chevy had been incorrect. As the officers got closer, they realized there was someone inside this car. They went up to the driver's side window, and there was a man sitting in the driver's seat with his car off and a camera in his lap. So they told him, "You need to step out of the vehicle." The officers wanted to know what he was doing there. The sun's about to go down, and this man's like, "Well, I've been here all day just taking pictures," hence the camera. And the officers were like, "Pictures of what?" He's like, "Wildlife. There's a lot of birds in this area." One of the officers asked if this man saw any people while he was shooting pictures of birds. The man said, "Well, yeah, there were a few down there." So one of the officers went a step further, asking, "How about some teenage girls? Did you happen to see them?" He says, "No, I don't think so. I can't recall." The guy's demeanor was just off, so they pressed him and he got defensive. And that's the worst thing you can do with a police officer, one of the many worst things you can do. So the cop got kind of passive-aggressive with him and made a snarky comment about maybe the guy got a few shots of some bikini-clad teenagers in his roll of film. And that's when the dude kind of goes off on him. He's like, "No, I'm not like that. I didn't take any pictures of teenagers dancing on the beach." Ha! Wait a minute, who said anything about them dancing? So the officers got suspicious. He was offering up information that they had not provided to him. This gave them a reason to want to search his car. Of course it did. And the man says, wait, I have a gun in my glove compartment." And at that point, the officers decided they needed to bring this man down for a formal interview. Even though at this point he's pleading with them that he didn't do anything wrong, by this time it was getting late. Back in Thomasville, the girls had told their parents they would be back by evening, and it's dinner time. Megan told her mom she would be home for dinner, so by now, she's wondering why she hasn't shown up. When Megan didn't show up by 6 p.m., Shirley decided to call over to Cherish's house to see if they went over there instead, but they hadn't, and this worried her. However, the girls were responsible, so she figured, you know what? They're probably just having fun and running a little late. It was a waiting game now. Meanwhile, investigator John Richards from the Thomasville Sheriff's Office and Agent John Heinen from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation had been notified about Megan and Cherish. Back in Florida, Officer Rotenberry had started to put together a task force with other FDLE officers and a number of other agencies, including the Parks and Wildlife Department, the GBI, as well as the Thomasville Police back in Georgia. 2 officers were sent out, one to Megan's and the other to Cherish's home, to notify their families about what had happened, and it was devastating for both households. It was like losing 2 daughters, since the girls were so very close. And there is no easy way to tell someone that their loved one is never coming home. It's unbelievable. And of course, in the midst of all of this, time is ticking away. Though the officers try their very best and are even trained to give these types of notifications and be sympathetic, they also need to ask questions. Their presence is twofold. They're there to be the bearers of bad news, but they're also there to gather information from the families that may aid them in their search for the killer. Megan's mom offered up some details about who her daughter spent the most time with. Megan was at the DeSantis household all the time, and if she wasn't over there, then the girls were over at Shirley's house. The only other person she spent time with was Cherish's boyfriend, Alex, who hung out a lot. Shirley said he even came over the night before, but it was really late. However, she didn't think he had anything to do with something like this. But in any case, everyone is a suspect until they're ruled out. What stumped the detectives was how the killer was able to get so close to the girls without them running away or there being a struggle of some kind. So it seemed like it had to be someone they knew or trusted or felt wasn't a threat to them in order for the killer to be able to walk right up without a scream or either of them running away. Right now, they still have that man who was blocking Megan's car at the station, and they are grilling him until he finally admits he did see the girls. He still says he has nothing to do with the murders because they were alive when he passed them on the beach. He even takes a polygraph. Meanwhile, the medical examiner has determined that the girls were both shot twice in the head at close range with a .38 caliber weapon. There were no other signs of injuries or forced intercourse. The man they were questioning had a 9mm, and he passed the polygraph, so they let him go at this point. By the next morning, news had spread about the double homicide on the secluded Florida beach. Articles came out in both Florida and Georgia asking the public for any information they may have in relation to the crime. As their loved ones and schoolmates were struggling to understand and deal with this seemingly senseless murder that still remained a mystery, one classmate, who wanted to remain anonymous, said that she had been down to that same part of the beach before with a friend, just laying out in the sun, and that's probably what Megan and Cherish were doing. Nothing unusual, she said. It was so hard to believe that her friend was dead. She was still in shock, and it probably wouldn't even hit her until she went back to class and the girls weren't there. That's when it would really sink in. When something like this happens in a small town, it's all the locals talk about. Every news station is out there, trying to make it the biggest story because that's what's going to sell their papers. I say it all the time. It's sad, but true. If it bleeds, it leads. So of course, many stories and rumors were spreading, and not all of the people were sympathetic. There was one lady who lived in Alligator Point, and she was interviewed. She had only been living there for 2 weeks, but she was kind of victim-blaming. Not only did she portray Alligator Point as a rough area, but she also said that anyone who went down there without a man, a gun, or a dog was just stupid, as though they were asking for trouble. But she didn't have any useful information to provide to the police. Cherish and Megan weren't doing anything stupid. These were 2 young girls who were enjoying their spring break, and unfortunately, they were victims of an extremely unfortunate situation that was completely out of their control. No matter what precautions they took, they could have never anticipated the tragedy that unfolded. Clayton TF was interviewed by police. He was the owner of the Point Lounge in Alligator Point, just down the road from where the girls were found. He was upset with the way people were describing the area because this was bad for business. This murder was bad for his business, and he relies on the customers feeling safe. He said this was the first time anything like this had ever happened. He also added that he and about 5 other guys were adding a sun deck to his business that Friday afternoon, and they were doing a lot of hammering. So they didn't hear a thing and weren't aware of anything that had gone wrong until law enforcement showed up to take a statement from him. He did say that the part of the beach where the girls were found was much more secluded than any other area. It faces east across the Appalachee Bay, and it's not easy to find if you aren't looking for it. If you didn't know where to look for the signs, you would drive right past it on the narrow country road that winds through the pines. No one understood how anyone could have been randomly driving down that road and somehow found that particular area of the beach and gunned down 2 girls like this. It just didn't make sense. That's why officers in Thomasville focused their attention on Alex Hunt, Cherish's boyfriend. They paid him a visit, and of course he was absolutely distraught over the news that his girlfriend and her best friend, 2 people he was very close to, had lost their lives. But the officers didn't back down. They wanted to know why he was over at Megan's really late the night before. He tells the officers, "I was just over there to see my girlfriend." They asked him, "Oh, did your parents know where you were going?" And he's like, "No, but they wouldn't care anyway. It's spring break." As they pressed him about the conversations he had with the girls, they asked him if he knew they were going to the beach and if he had made plans to meet them down there. He said they didn't talk about anything like that the night before, and he had nothing to do with their murders. But then he said something that caught the officers off guard. He told them he didn't even own a gun. The thing is, no one had mentioned a gun to him or anyone else. Of course, he could have read it or heard about it in the news, but it did raise a red flag. They wanted Alex's alibi, to which he replied that he was working at the plant he worked at in town, and he told them to have his employers give them the information. Investigator Richard confirmed that Alex was at work that day when the girls were killed, so Alex was checked off their list. That didn't mean the rumors stopped, though. There just wasn't a clear motive, so people were making up their own version of events, and this was before social media. Now, this is a common occurrence. So much speculation before the investigators can even do their job. Soon enough, false information had spread that the authorities had found the murder weapon, but that wasn't true. No weapon had been found at all. The only reason they knew the caliber of the weapon was due to the autopsies when they found the actual bullets. This story got a lot of coverage in the news, and it could have been because the girls were young, but it was most likely because it had to do with Pete DeSantis. He was connected. Even the governor of Georgia at the time, Zell Miller, was speaking about what happened. He was asking the public to come forward, and he offered a $2,000 reward for any information that could lead them to the killer. Hundreds of calls were coming in, and investigators had a lot more interviews to conduct. One person came forward and talked about how the area the girls were in used to be a nude beach. And it was true. Not only that, but the police had been out there a few times recently for calls about women sunbathing topless. But again, this was an attempt at explaining why the girls were targeted. Both girls were wearing their bikinis, and there were no signs that this crime was sexually motivated. It was just another piece of information that seemed pretty useless. I mean, why would that lead to their murder anyway? Would someone be that upset that they would turn a gun on them for being topless on a beach? It just really did not make sense. It seemed a little bit like victim blaming yet again. By Monday, March 30, just a couple of days after the girls were found deceased on the beach together, they were buried in separate funerals, but at the same cemetery, Laurel Hill, where their loved ones went to say their final goodbyes. Megan's mom described her daughter as strong-willed and outspoken. Cherish's father said she was sweet and funny, and she loved to make other people laugh. Both girls were so very loved by their friends and family, and their loss was felt deeply throughout their entire community. Megan and Cherish's family members and friends were confused and upset. They were desperate to understand what happened to them. The community of Thomasville was devastated, and they were in need of answers. They wanted to know why two young girls were targeted and killed, why someone would commit such a horrific act of violence. By the time school started up again, it just seemed surreal, with both of the girls' empty seats in class. The principal, Jerry Studdard, commented that the few days of spring break that were still left between the murders and the students coming back did provide somewhat of a cushion, but the sadness was evident on campus. Some of the students did interviews, and I have one of those that I thought was telling about the way these students felt. Misha Tillman, a 17-year-old classmate of Megan, said she always saw the two childhood friends, Megan and Cherish, teasing one another and walking down the hall. Misha said she was having a really hard time dealing with her absence. She was crying, and others were crying too. A group of the students actually had to leave class to go get counseling with a guidance counselor. She also added that most people think Megan and Cherish must have told someone that they were going down there and that they were followed to Alligator Point. She said she's not scared, but she just wants to know who did this. Rotenberry knew from his interviews that it was common knowledge that the girls were headed down there. People knew, but he couldn't confirm whether they knew the killer. They could have, that's all he could tell the public. At this point, they still had no leads. I kept wondering if it had something to do with Cherish's father's tobacco business. Could there be someone upset with him in their business dealings, like a deal gone wrong, and so they took it out on his daughter? The FDLE and the GBI worked hard for weeks to solve the girl's murder, but they found no leads to pursue. Megan and Cherish's murders mystified everyone involved in this case. There seemed to be no motive for this crime, and the lack of evidence made it extremely difficult for police to determine who was responsible. Even the most seasoned investigators were baffled. The pressure from the community was building, like it usually does in a small community, but the local Thomasville police couldn't do much. Florida was leading the case. They had one clue though, that blue Chevy Nova. Back then, Georgia did not have a vehicle database that connected car colors to owners, but Florida did, so that is where they put their focus. They pulled up every record of anyone in the area who had registered a blue vehicle with the state of Florida, of course with the emphasis on any resident that had a vehicle similar to an older model blue Chevy Nova, and they sent out agents to investigate. They went door to door. It was a huge task, but these investigators weren't even sleeping. They were obsessively trying to track down every single car that could possibly match this description, and they would get a hit here and there. Someone would seem suspicious. They even tracked someone down that lived right across the street from one of the girls back in Thomasville who drove a similar car, but he had an alibi. Another person of interest came up on the radar. It was a guy who was lingering around the crime scene, and when the officers asked him for his identification, this man handed them a Department of Corrections identification card, like a prison card. This was a 28-year-old man who had a long criminal record with over 13 arrests, and he had just recently been released from state prison. Again, it seemed like a very promising lead, but like all the others, it ended up that he had nothing to do with this crime. There was more and more speculation swirling around. Some people believed that the girls had been caught up in a drug smuggling operation, that there were smugglers who had possibly come up on that secluded part of the beach, saw the girls, didn't expect anyone to be there, and shot them dead since they would have been witnesses. But after looking into this theory, there was no boat seen. There was no evidence that a boat came up on shore, and no one saw anything, so they ruled it out and moved on. This case looked like it was going to be unsolved until a very strange phone call came into the Franklin County Sheriff's Office in Tallahassee, Florida. A woman was on the other line. She was telling the investigators that she knew who shot the girls because she was there when it happened. So of course they were dialed into what this woman was saying, reigniting their hope that they were going to find the killer and bring justice and closure to this case for the girls' families. The caller said this man's name is Sammy Haynes, and he lives about 16 minutes away from the beach, but she wouldn't give them any information about who she was. When they asked, she hung up. They tried to track where she was calling from, but they determined that it was a payphone. This woman had just implicated herself in a crime, having been at the scene, so they really wanted to know who she was, but there was no luck. However, they tracked down a guy named Sammy Hannis. They called the number associated with this local man, and his father answered the phone. He said, "Oh, you're looking for my son Sammy?" "Yeah, well, he works construction out in Atlanta, Georgia, and he was gone at the moment." Atlanta, well, that's a connection right there. He works out in Georgia, so he could have known the girls, seen them driving to Florida that day, and followed them. They had to track the Sammy guy down. But for now, they went to all these local establishments to see if anyone knew this man, had heard this name before, or had interacted with him. That might match this guy's description, so they go out to the bar in that area called the Point Lounge, whose owner, Clayton Taff, had already been interviewed. We heard from him before. Well, a bartender comes forward, and she says she recalls something very odd that happened the day of the murders, a weird interaction with a patron. He comes in right when they opened. He orders a Bloody Mary, but she wasn't completely set up. She felt bad because she was trying to get things in order to make his drink, and there was a delay, so she told him, "You know what? It's on the house, don't worry about it." But no, he insisted on paying. It doesn't really seem that odd, but he's like, "You better keep that money, 'cause it'll be the first and last time I come in here." It just kinda gave her the creeps. Maybe it was innocent though. Maybe he was just referring to the bad service, like, "You better keep what you can get because you weren't getting this customer's money again." That type of thing. He was there for about 40 minutes or so, but this would have put him in the area where the girls were murdered about an hour before they were found. It's frustrating because you get what you think is a lead, and then you go investigate. You have to. Sometimes, without cameras or anything else to go on, it goes nowhere. But the questions linger. Before they can really look into this Sammy Haynes guy, he calls into the station. He's still out in Atlanta but expected to be back that night, so he agrees that he'll come in the next morning and speak with them. He does say that he is 6 hours away and that he was at the time of the murders as well, but they think he could have driven there and back. He insists, "No, someone's giving you false information about me, and that someone is probably my soon-to-be ex-wife's sister, Linda." This sounds so convoluted, but he said, "Check my alibi. I'm telling you she's making this crap up about me. She is just trying to get back at me for something I did that she didn't like." This sounds super extreme. This man was telling the truth. They tracked down Linda, and sure enough, this was her way of getting revenge on him for not treating her sister right. I mean, this is a crime to interfere with a criminal investigation. She could have been arrested. But right now, they have more important things to worry about. Besides, Sammy's alibi checked out, so they just check him off their list. But due to this false tip, detectives spend their precious time, hours and hours of a day, verifying it rather than investigating other leads. This is valuable time, money, and energy wasted, and it also results in missed opportunities to solve the case. It was tough. This case was all anyone was talking about, from Florida to Georgia. It was like the wounds couldn't heal, especially because there was no one in custody. There were locals who would call into the police stations, and if one of the investigators on the case answered, they would go off on them. They would yell at them, saying, "Why aren't you out in the streets finding the killer?" But they were working this case non-stop. Still, if this next thing didn't happen, they may have never solved this case, no matter how hard they worked on it. On Friday, May 15th, around 10 a.m., a call came in to the Franklin County Sheriff's Office, a familiar type of call. On the other line was a woman from Tallahassee who said she knew who killed Megan and Cherish. She said it was her ex-boyfriend. Of course, the police weren't going to get their hopes up. This could be another jilted ex trying to get revenge, or their 15 minutes of fame. So they asked her why she thought her ex killed the girls, and she said, "Because he told me he did." He had called her just the evening before, and he sounded really odd, like he wasn't right. There was something going on, and he confessed to killing the girls at Alligator Point. They asked her, "What's your ex's name?" And she said, "Robert Neil Rodriguez." And get this, it sounded familiar to one of the investigators, and he looked down this list of people that he'd already spoken to, and this man's name is on it. They had crossed him off as not being a suspect. The reason he was on their list in the first place is that they knew he had a blue vehicle. So they asked his ex, did he drive a blue Chevy Nova? And she said no, he drives a blue 1979 Plymouth Volare. These cars are so very similar. Look at them. They look almost identical to me. I'm not a car person, but they're similar enough. The ex-girlfriend couldn't provide much more information. She had no idea where he was now, but that he was leaving town and he had a gun. The last place that she knew he was living was with his mother at 520 East College Avenue in Tallahassee, Florida. He lived about an hour away from Alligator Point. So was this really the man responsible for these murders? What would he be doing in that area? But now that they had this man's name and the style of the car, they put out a bulletin across the entire country. They pulled up his information and cross-checked it with what the man said when he had been on a telephone interview with them just a couple of weeks ago. Back in the end of April and early May, they had contacted him in reference to his blue vehicle being registered in the state of Florida. Now, as soon as they searched his name in their database, they were stunned at the results because Robert is a former police officer from Portland, Oregon. He was hired in March of 1975, but he resigned just 2 years later. Could this be one of their own who had committed such a heartless crime? They called over to the Portland PD and retrieved Robert's personnel file. They wanted to find out as much information about this man as they possibly could. While they were making calls and looking at his files, they also sent a few officers out to his last known address. No one's there, so they knock on the neighbors' doors, and one of the neighbors said Robert left his apartment around May 2nd or May 3rd. They weren't sure, but they did mention that he was very depressed since his mother, Irene Rodriguez, had died on Easter morning. Wow, this was all too much. They felt like they were getting somewhere. However, they had done this before, and it ended up not being a viable lead. But the time he left did kind of match up with the time frame that they had called to interview him about his car and gone out there to speak with him. Now, I want to tell you what they gathered from Robert's personnel file from the Portland PD. He was born on an Air Force base in Southwest Florida in 1950 and was currently 42 years old. His father was a 22-year Air Force veteran, and his family traveled a lot. They relocated several times while Robert was growing up, which forced him to move from school to school. He attended at least 7 different schools in Florida, Georgia, and Alabama during his childhood. In 1968, he graduated high school in Fort Walton Beach, Florida, which was about 2.5 hours away from Tallahassee. Then he enrolled at Okaloosa Walton Junior College before transferring out to Brigham Young University in Utah. Now, this is a very well-known Mormon university, and his personnel file stated that he did become a Mormon while attending this school. He spent the next 2 years doing Mormon missionary work in Guatemala and then went back to Utah to graduate with his degree in law enforcement from Brigham Young. He was hired by the Portland PD thereafter until he resigned on good terms, according to his supervisor, Sergeant Derek Foxworth of the Portland PD. It was noted that Robert had no disciplinary actions or anything like that. Then he moved to Tallahassee in 1978, where he eventually tried to go back to school at Florida State University. He wanted to get into a different career at the time, but things just weren't really working out for him. He spent the next few years between jobs and trying to go back to graduate school. He was currently working as a sign maker and a janitor. He was also a member of the Unity Christian Church, where he would regularly give Sunday morning sermons. Robert had been married to a woman named Virginia Blair from 1981 through 1985, but according to her, the marriage ended because Robert was a drug addict. She said that her knowledge of drug addiction at the time was minimal, and she naively believed him when he assured her that he would seek treatment. But when she came to the realization that he wasn't going to, she ended the relationship. Like I mentioned, he did attend FSU as a graduate student studying political science, but he never obtained a degree. In addition to painting and working as a janitor, Robert held several jobs over the years. He was a car salesman and delivered for the newspaper, the Tallahassee Democrat, from 1985 to 1988 before going into bankruptcy in 1999. But where was Robert now? That's what authorities wanted to know, and they didn't have to wait too long for their next lead. Just 8 hours later, around 6 p.m., the phone rang again at the Franklin County station. This time, it was a man's voice on the other end, and he identified himself as Robert Neil Rodriguez, the man whose ex-girlfriend had called in 8 hours earlier and said he confessed to the double homicide at Alligator Point. Being a former police officer, he offered up his driver's license number as proof that he was who he said he was. This is when this entire case gets crazier to me. It's something I've never heard happening before in any of my other cases, and that's why it interested me so much. He confessed to the officer that he was the killer. Just like that. He admits it, and of course, they want to know where he is. He tells them he's at a payphone off Interstate I-40 in New Mexico and had been traveling 4 days from Florida to that location. At that moment, they began the process of getting a warrant to search Robert's Tallahassee apartment. They also put out a statewide bulletin with the suspect's description. He was 42 years old, 5 feet 8 inches tall, 155 pounds, and balding, but had some dark brown and gray hair on the sides of his head, with a neatly trimmed gray and black beard and mustache. He was said to be driving a dark blue 1979 Plymouth Volare with a Florida tag, HWNN5G. Just by the way the man was speaking, he seemed distraught, as though he was not in a very good state of mind, and authorities believed that he could be at risk for taking his own life. So they hurried to get this information out, but they were afraid to put his picture in the media because they wanted him to be brought in alive. They were worried that if he saw himself in the media, it would set him off, or set someone else off, and that they would end up getting justice with their own hands. Robert provided investigators with information that only the killer would know, things that were not published to the media, like the fact that there was a towel over Megan's face, and other details as well. The detectives told him to turn himself in, that they could help him, but Robert was like, "There's no way you can help me, and I am not going to prison." It's a known fact that prison can be a very difficult place for police officers. As inmates, in some cases, officers that face incarceration are placed in protective custody. They're there with sexual deviants or in the prison's medical facility because of the danger they face behind bars. They are targets. So instead of turning himself in, Robert told the detectives that he was on his way to the Grand Canyon, where he was going to take matters into his own hands. Of course, they tried to talk him out of it. They tried to negotiate with him, but he said it was too late for that and hung up. The detectives knew they didn't have much time. The Grand Canyon was about 6 hours from New Mexico, so they had highway patrolmen and state troopers in New Mexico out there on the roads, trying to locate him before it was too late. Back at his apartment, they were carrying out a search from top to bottom and uncovered a collection of paperbacks about death and other items they thought would be useful in this investigation. However, they didn't turn up a .38 caliber weapon like the one used on Megan and Cherish. They also reached out to the pastor at the Unity Church, where Robert delivered the Sunday sermons. Her name was Reverend Julie Keene. She told detectives that Robert was fighting a battle within himself, a battle between his loving, good part and a part that was angry and sick, and the sick side may have won. She described Robert as an articulate and bright graduate student at one time, but truly lacked focus and was merely playing at school just to find his way. He was a good speaker, he delivered really good messages, but would also suffer from serious, unexplained bouts of depression. He told her he thought about taking his own life at least twice and that he had been taking the antipsychotic medication Prozac. It's been used to treat depression since it was approved by the FDA back in 1987. However, it had been linked to violent behavior and thoughts of self-inflicted harm. At that time, it was still being evaluated by the FDA. If you have any personal experience or knowledge about Prozac, let me know. At this point, they actually sent out more bulletins, and a nationwide manhunt began. The next morning on Saturday, May 16th at 9 a.m. Mountain Time, 11 a.m. Eastern, a call came in to a police station out in New Mexico. The person on the other line was at a rest stop off I-40 in New Mexico. It was a member of the Disabled Veterans Group, and they were doing a fundraiser out there. They said they found a blue Plymouth car parked nearby with a lifeless man inside. When local officers went out there to investigate, what they found alerted them to call the FDLE. The car had a Utah license plate, and that really didn't add up. But sure enough, when they ran that plate, they discovered that it had been reported stolen, along with one other license plate from a motel parking lot in Utah on May 8th. When officers approached the vehicle, they saw what looked like a deceased or passed-out man lying lifeless in the driver's seat. They opened the door and noticed a handwritten note on the dashboard. It was for whoever discovered his body. It read, "Cyanide poisoning by mouth. Do not do mouth-to-mouth, it may poison you." The man matched the description of Robert Rodriguez, and there was a clear glass vial with a white substance tied around his neck by a leather strap like a necklace. In the passenger seat was a brown folding notebook, where Robert explained that he took cyanide to take his life for the sake of the girl's parents, for their peace of mind, and to avoid a prison term. The note went on to say that he mailed a letter to the Florida authorities. It was going to be addressed to Special Agent Delbert McGarvey, and this letter would explain why he killed the two Thomasville, Georgia teenagers. A .22 caliber weapon was found in the car, but they did not find a .38 like the one used in the homicides. FDLE agents and lab technicians were sent out to New Mexico that same day in order to make a positive identification of Robert Rodriguez through fingerprints, and this was later confirmed. They had their man, but they did not close this case yet because remember, they were expecting a letter. While they weren't the only ones that were going to get them, there were 11 letters in total sent out in the days before Robert took his life. He drank a mixture of scotch and cyanide. The story doesn't end here. Those letters held the clue to so much more than anyone could have expected. While the FDLE awaited their expected letter, they were able to put together a timeline of Robert's movements. After the news released a photo of Robert, the owner of the Point Lounge, Clayton Taff, remember him? We've talked about him twice, came forward and confirmed that the man who came into his bar around noon on March 27th, the day the girls were killed, was indeed Robert Rodriguez. He must have left somewhere around 1 o'clock that afternoon and made his way to Alligator Point, which was right down the road. According to the off-duty officer who reported the girls' bodies, he and his wife initially passed them at 1:45 p.m., so they believed they were already dead before the second time they passed by when they got a closer look and called 911. The blue car that was reported being seen after the sound of gunshots around 12:30 was indeed Robert's, and though he would have been just leaving the bar at that time, it does coincide with the time frame. Then, Robert's mother passed away on Easter Sunday, April 19th, at an extended care facility. That day he called his ex-girlfriend, and he was distraught and crying. He went over to her house, where she talked to him and let him cry for several hours. Authorities found out that his dad and brother were both deceased. They were buried in Fort Walton, Florida. His brother died in 1966, and his father 1 year later in 1967. They weren't able to locate any other living relatives, which could have been the reason he finally confessed. They didn't know yet. But just a few days after his mother died in late April, investigators, including Agent Delbert McGarvey, the one who was expecting that letter to be addressed to him, came out to talk to Robert at his apartment about his blue vehicle. The first time they went out, he wasn't home, so they left a card. You know what Robert did? He actually called them back, set up an interview, and offered to take a lie detector test. He explained to the detective that he was a police officer, and that's why they didn't really flag him as a suspect. At the same time, he was telling his ex-girlfriend that he didn't think he was a suspect. even after talking to investigators, because as a former police officer, he knew they just had to cover all their bases. He was right. He wasn't on their radar at that point. His ex-girlfriend said that Robert asked her, "Do you believe me? Do you believe I didn't do it?" She said, "Of course." And she really didn't think he did. Not at all. She was actually floored when he called her that night to confess. When he initially left town, he wasn't really doing it in a suspicious way either. He said he was just going to his stepsister's house in Tampa. Days later, his neighbor said he did leave town. It was around the beginning of May, possibly the 4th or the 5th. He was in Alabama on the 6th, Colorado on the 7th, and Utah on the 8th, where he stole the 2 license plates from a motel parking lot. Then he was off to Portland from the 8th to the 12th, and then went off the grid. However, his ex-girlfriend heard from him, and she thought it was a little bit odd. He called her back on May 8th and said, "Hey, can you do me a favor and clean Unity Church for me?" That was where he was a janitor once a week, and it was his only source of income. So maybe he was worried about not getting his paycheck, or it could have been for an alibi. Even if they didn't see him at the church, they would have known it was clean, so it would buy him time. Something his ex found out a few days later was that he was running out of the night. He called her from a payphone in the Midwest, confessing to the murders. He kept putting quarters in, but he said he was running out of gas and money. Finally, in a tearful voice, he said, "I did kill those girls," but he didn't know why. Then he added, "I'm going to make sure that I won't be able to hurt anybody again. I'll make sure they find me and that this won't be one of those unsolved cases. I'll make sure they know I did it." He said he was going to take his life and begged her, "Please, please wait until the next morning to call the police." She promised she would, and she kept that promise. The next morning, on the 15th, she called the police, and later that day, Robert called and confessed. By the next morning, he was found dead, but it could have happened any time between that 6 p.m. call and 11 a.m. Eastern when the individuals found him. When Megan and Cherish's parents got the news, they were equally stunned and confused. They just kept saying, "Why?" Megan's dad wondered if he was a hired killer. He had been suspicious for a long time that this was a professional hit, execution style. "I told you at one point I thought that too." The whole business deal gone wrong with the DeSantis family. Cherish's mother, Dot, had a question. She said, "I wonder if he just hated young girls and he's some kind of serial killer?" This was after hearing about those books in his house about death. She just figured if he was so obsessed with killing, wouldn't he have killed more than 2 people by now? At that moment, she didn't know how close she was to the truth. On Sunday, May 17th, the church members at Unity Church gathered for their normal weekly sermon, one that Robert frequently delivered. They didn't know him as Robert, though. They called him Bob. He wasn't like the man they were reading about in the newspapers. He was described by those close to him as a gentle soul, someone who helped others. I found this to be both interesting and scary, that someone could have 2 strikingly different personalities. In one way they could be so nice, and in another, so evil. But we've seen this many times before. Ted Bundy, BTK, John Wayne Gacy. They lived fairly normal lives. Many of the church members were crying, and they were trying to comfort one another as they tried to make sense of it all. A woman who had recently been dating Bob was sobbing uncontrollably, and another woman said that the fact he left a note warning someone not to give him mouth-to-mouth was just like him, looking out for others. That was something he would do. A lady named Joyce Humph came forward to reporters and said that Bob helped her through her divorce, and that this whole situation has taught her that you really can't judge people. She said she would never know what dark night of the soul he was going through. She could never read about criminals the same way she used to, because now she knew one personally. Now she was going to think about all the people who loved that person because they exist. One of the other members was a man named Don Stewart. He worked as a psychologist at the Department of Corrections and knew Bob personally through the church. He said the men he dealt with were nothing like Bob. Of course, Bob had expressed anger here and there about relationships going badly, but nothing out of the ordinary. He also made a comment that he liked to think the loving environment at the church helped prevent him from doing more than he did. Maybe it had, but not forever, obviously, and it didn't do enough. What do you think of that? I know it's hard to see this person as a human doing what he did, but they have these 2 sides to them. The Arizona Daily Sun in Flagstaff got a letter from Robert on the next day, Monday, May 18th. It was addressed to a reporter named Xavier Brion. This letter was the first of many that Robert had sent prior to taking his life. This one was intended to alert authorities to where his body was because he was expecting them to find it in the Grand Canyon, but he didn't make it that far. It was a one-page letter and began, "To the news staff, here's a tip on a good news story for you." It then went on to read, "By the time you receive this, I expect to be dead by cyanide poisoning and/or gunshot. You'll find my body on the side or top of a large hill, which can be approached by auto down a dirt road in the Coconino National Forest. The road is on the left of Highway 180, 30.8 miles from where 180 leaves Humphrey Street in Flagstaff, 22.7 miles past the last paved road on the left in the snowball going toward the Grand Canyon. If for some reason this is not possible, I'll be at the rim of the Grand Canyon. My car is a '79 Plymouth Val with stolen Utah tag 183 FBR. It concluded with, whether they know it or not, I'm wanted for 3 murders by the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. Agent McGarvey will appreciate a call from you when you find my body and will fill you in on the details. You may tell him that the 3rd murder is of Valerie Hunt in 1984 and that he will receive full details on all 3 in the mail. Tell him he can take the weekend off. I don't think they can prove any of the 3, but I can't live with myself if I'm going to act like this. Thank you, Robert Rodriguez." 3 killings. That's right, 3. Wow. See how crazy this is? I told you I've never heard of a case like this before. So of course the media went crazy after the story came out. Who was this 3rd victim, Valerie Hunt? Well, she was a 22-year-old girl from Tallahassee Community College, a student who disappeared in 1984. Her body was found that same September near a sinkhole off State Road 267 in Wakulla County, Florida. Valerie Hunt worked for Home and Land Publishing Corporation, and her supervisor described her as a responsible and valued employee. He told the Tallahassee Democrat that it was completely unlike Valerie to take off without notice. Law enforcement officers searched the woods near Lofton Pond on horseback, on foot, and by helicopter for Valerie. Divers searched the pond, but they still could not locate her. She was a strong swimmer, so her family thought it was not likely that she would have drowned. After a few days with no sign of Valerie, a massive search of Lofton Pond was finally called off. During the investigation into Valerie Hunt's disappearance, more information emerged. Valerie's roommate told investigators she was last seen on June 11, 1984, before she left town. She said that Valerie's boyfriend reported her missing when her boss called him to tell him that Valerie hadn't shown up for work. This was 4 days later. By September 1984, there was still no sign of Valerie. At that point, her friends and family offered a $2,000 reward for information leading to her whereabouts. Investigators refused to admit that foul play was involved. They only considered her missing and thought her disappearance was suspicious. At the time, they still believed that Valerie could have left on her own, but they were wrong. It was confirmed through dental records that the skeletal remains discovered in September 1984 belonged to Valerie Hunt. Now, all these years later, Leon County Sheriff Sergeant John Livings, who had been investigating Valerie's case at the time 8 years earlier, was contacted regarding this recent confession. He wanted to set the record straight and say this case was never closed. Valerie's cause of death had never been determined since, sadly, her remains were severely decomposed. By the time she was found, an anthropologist from Florida State University tried to assemble Valerie's body in an attempt to determine her cause of death, but it still remained unknown. He also wanted to point out to the media that they mistakenly reported she was abducted from a Westwood shopping center, but that was not true. There was no evidence that ever happened. As a matter of fact, she was heading out to the same pond where her body was later found. It was a sunbathing spot off of Spring Hill Road. Valerie had stopped to get some gas, then went to the store to get her dad a Father's Day card, and then to the bank before heading out to the pond that day. Something she did quite often, whether she was alone or with friends. She wasn't reported missing until about 3 days later. Her car was found 7 days later on Lofton Road, and the skeletal remains were located in a heavily wooded area off State Road 267. It couldn't be determined if she was shot or stabbed, but at the time, they ruled it was strangulation. The sergeant said he still had Valerie's file on his desk, and every so often he would go over to it, open it up, and look for any leads. Valerie was a good-natured girl. She had a lot of friends, loved cats, and people said she wouldn't do anything to hurt anyone. The sergeant said he wasn't going to close her case just yet, just because this letter came out confessing. He would need more proof, but he wanted to provide closure to her family. One thing's for sure, all three ladies were sunbathing, or so it seemed, with this confession of the third murder. The sergeant came forward to enlighten the media about the fact that the story they had been running for years was not consistent with the truth, that she was not taken from a shopping center, but instead from where she was laying out in her bikini. How sad. This new revelation prompted Megan's mom to make another statement, and this time she said she was very on edge about why this whole thing happened. She said, "To me, he took the coward's way out," and went on to say it made her wonder how he physically was able to walk around and why he waited 8 years to have this passion for murder again. I agree, it's very interesting. And now we wait once again for the next letter. Sure enough, the next day, on May 19th, the FDLE received that letter addressed to Agent Albert McGarvey, just like Robert said. It was a 6-page letter, and they would keep it under wraps until they could verify everything. What they did release publicly is what we already know. Robert repeated the confession he made by phone that he was responsible for ending the lives of Cherish and Megan, and that he also took the life of Valerie Hunt. Something else was made public. Robert made comments that alluded to other letters he sent, sounding as though he had sent the teenagers' parents letters as well. So they alerted the families to be on the lookout and to notify authorities if they received anything in the mail, because it would be considered evidence. Right now, the investigators were going line by line through the letter, stating that it contained more than 60 leads that they had to follow up on. But when they were asked if he confessed to any more murders, they said no. There was no evidence in the letter that would lead them to believe that he was a serial killer or responsible for any other killings at this point. I just want to point out that when I was researching this case, he was filed under being a serial killer. The thing is, he killed 3 people, but it's usually 3 people in 3 different circumstances that make someone a serial killer, not 2 people at once and 1 other person. So he's not a serial killer, not yet, anyway. A spokesperson for the FDLE, John Joyce, said that they did not have any other confessions to any other crimes. There was nothing in that letter that led them to any other grave sites or anything like that. It didn't mean that this man didn't kill anyone else at some other point in time somewhere else. There just wasn't any evidence in the letter, and they weren't going to jeopardize any investigations by making the contents public at that point. However, remember Sheriff Warren Rotenberry? Well, he did speak publicly about the matter, stating that it appeared this was a random act of violence. He said that Robert didn't appear to have known Megan or Cherish personally, and they were still piecing together the facts about the third victim. His car was being shipped back from New Mexico to their headquarters in Florida for a more thorough investigation. That same day, Robert's ex-girlfriend received a letter in the mail, and it was said that a different ex-girlfriend also received a letter. Both of those letters expressed remorse for what he had done. The very next day, on May 20th, the DeSantis family, Cherish's mom and dad, received a letter from Robert. Peter contacted the FDLE as soon as he was notified by USPS, who intercepted the letter at the post office. The police department took the original and said they would send him a copy to keep. They told him not to release anything publicly, but they didn't stop him from talking about how it made him feel to know what was inside that letter. He said that he had never had possession of it. He had never touched it, but he knew what it said. Well, the very next day, on May 21st, Megan's dad, John, received a letter as well, and he too had to turn it over to the police. However, he spoke publicly about it, and I probably would too. I don't think they could hold me back. I'm really glad he did, because I was really curious. I'm sure you are too. I wasn't purposely keeping it from you. It's just that, going by this timeline, this is what was happening. It was a lot of suspense. John Carr, Megan's dad, was angry more than anything else. He said he saw both letters, one to the DeSantis family and one to him, and they were pretty much identical. Neither of them offered an apology at all. John said it took this guy a page and a half, but he sort of explained why he did it. It seemed to John that Robert had a lot on his mind. From the letters we know about, At least he must have done a lot of writing in a short period of time. John was referring to his letter, the one to the other family, the two to his girlfriends, the law enforcement agents, and the one to the Arizona paper. They were all written the same day. Most likely, he went on to say that the letter provided some detail on how Robert had done what he did, but he wished that he hadn't. He did not disclose those details, but he did say that apparently Robert just happened upon them. He stated, "When I think of this worthless son of a, it must have made him feel like a man to pull a trigger and put 2 bullets in my little girl's head. I don't understand why he waited 8 years between the killings. I think he got some religion, then he lost it, and then went out and killed again." It wasn't until August that the officers finally released the 11 letters that Robert wrote. I tried my best to gather as much information as I could, because even though the news said they were released, I couldn't find any full letters, only parts. He wrote one to each of the 3 victims' families, Cherish, Megan, and Valerie, one to his church, the Arizona newspaper, 2 to his ex-girlfriends, and some to his friends. The longest was the 6th pager to the FDLE. In that letter, Robert stated, "I can't say this word, no forced intercourse, no provocation, no excuse." He also said that after the 1984 murder, he told himself, "This is not me. I could live a normal life and not repeat this, and if I did repeat, I would take my own life." Police noted that Robert had gotten divorced shortly before the 1984 murder of Valerie Hunt, and had just broken up with his girlfriend before the murders of Cherish and Megan. Recall his church friend, who said that he would get angry now and then about relationship stuff. Well, maybe this is how he took out his anger. In each letter, he confessed to killing all 3 girls and stated he didn't actually know why he was taking his own life, whether it was to keep him from killing again or to avoid a long prison sentence. He stated, "People have a right to be free of random killings, and I cannot live with myself if I cannot trust myself to avoid such actions. Today, I'm going to sit on a hill and take my life." In the letter to Valerie's family, I have part of that one. Here's the section right here at the end when he signs it. "I'm sincerely sorry for my actions and for your long suffering, wondering what happened. I assure you that Valerie suffered little, and for a little time. I hope my death will calm your heart somewhat. I have no explanation, and I do not myself understand my actions. I again am sorry, even unto death. God bless you, Bob Rodriguez. P.S. Please do not blame yourselves. I did this, not you. Please let the blame rest with me in my grave where it belongs." My question is, why would the family blame themselves? I just wondered that. There's no way I would blame anyone except the killer. Valerie's father told the Tallahassee Democrat that Robert Rodriguez caused his family heartache 3 times. When Valerie disappeared, when her body was discovered, and now when he wrote to them and confessed. He said, "I'm glad it's over for myself and my 2 children." In the letter to Cherish's family, he wrote in part, "On May 27th of March of this year, I went to Alligator Point in search of someone to force intercourse on." He used the term RW and spoke of a long-time mental obsession that he has no explanation for nor understanding of. He had a lust for forcing women into intercourse, but he never did that to his victims. He went on to explain that he encountered Megan and Cherish sunning themselves. They did nothing to provoke him. He claimed no excuse for his actions. Recall how Megan's dad said that he sort of explained how he did it, but he wished he hadn't. Apparently, to help the parents deal with the death, Robert said he shot each girl twice within no more than 5 or 10 seconds. I guess that was to explain how quick it was, that they didn't suffer, but I can see how that sounds just so heartless and cold. He offered no emotions in these letters and no apologies. There was no real solace given to any of their loved ones. He went on to explain that he never met the girls before and he chose them because they were young, attractive, and in an isolated area. Wow, that is so sad and sick. I saw something that appeared to be an excerpt from one of the letters to the reporter at the Arizona newspaper, where he said he shot Megan first and then Cherish began to scream and back away, so he shot Cherish too. He claimed there were no excuses and that there was no one else involved or anyone with any personal knowledge of the crime. All of the letters were pretty matter-of-fact and lacked emotion. Investigators later provided more context. Megan was holding a towel when he shot her, and it ended up over her head from the force of the bullet. She fell backward and it just flew over her, wasn't put there. He shot Cherish because she screamed, and then he went and shot both of them one more time to make sure they were dead before fleeing the scene. Okay, I found this to be very interesting, and that's why I want to share it before the end of this video. Unity Church provided the FDLE with an excerpt from a sermon that Robert delivered on July 15, 1990, just 2 years before he killed Megan and Cherish. And this is what it said in part. Wait till you hear this. It was very, very interesting to me. This was probably one of the most fascinating things in this case, and I'm going to tell you, it is eerie and telling. He said, "One of my favorite stories that I ever have read in my life, I happened to read in a Newsweek magazine. The fellow who shot George Wallace is named Arthur Bremer, and he kept a diary while he was traveling around the country trying to find a politician that he could get close enough to shoot. In this diary, he said that on a particular day, he had lost his girlfriend, and in his mind, she was the only person who ever really loved him in his life. He was pretty down that day and pretty upset, so what he did was he gathered up a bunch of ammunition and 2 guns, loaded the guns, and took his ammunition with him, and started down a street in Milwaukee. He was going to go stand on a street corner and murder people passing by, just kill whoever happened to be there. And then his diary said that on his way to that street corner, you can imagine what he looked like that day. He probably wasn't Mr. Friendly, but on his way to that street corner, he passed by a restaurant, and a waitress who was waiting a table at that restaurant looked up from what she was doing and smiled at him as he went by, and he turned around and went home. There are probably 20 or 30 people alive today because that waitress smiled at Arthur. Their children will be affected by that woman's love for a man who didn't look loving that day." End quote, end excerpt. And this man's sickening thoughts, because wow, just wow. I wouldn't go so far as to say a random waitress had love for some stranger passing by a restaurant she worked at. That's not love, that's merely kindness. But to think that Robert, in his unhinged mind, thought that this was the best story he had ever read about a waitress smiling at a psychopath who was on his way to annihilate random people because his girlfriend dumped him, and that one smile stopped the killer in his tracks, we're supposed to be in awe of that. Arthur Bremer, Robert's muse in the story, was also born the same year Robert was, in 1950, and he attempted to murder a U.S. presidential candidate, George Wallace, on May 15, 1972. May 15th is the same day that Robert confessed, I might add. Arthur also shot and injured 3 innocent people. He was sentenced to 35 years in prison and was released in November of 2007. Robert had a lot in common with Arthur, actually. Arthur also attended college but never got his degree. It said he dropped out and did odd jobs here and there. When he was demoted to busboy at a restaurant because patrons thought he was odd, he would talk to himself. He got angry and quit. Guess what he did afterward? He became a janitor, just like Robert, except he wasn't doing it at a church. He was at an elementary school. After his girlfriend, whom he had only been dating for a short while, broke up with him in 1972, Arthur began his assassination diary, which is actually a book he wrote and published. Robert must have just read that one little excerpt in a magazine that he stumbled upon. The book begins with this line, "It's my personal plan to assassinate by pistol either Richard Nixon or George Wallace. I intend to shoot one or the other while he attends a campaign rally for the Wisconsin primary." What he really wanted was fame. Although he did get a lot of media attention, it faded, and he never reached the infamy of his idols. But somehow, he was someone so notable to Robert that he would deliver a whole sermon about a smile that made him spare a group of innocent people. Too bad Robert couldn't spare Megan, Cherish, and Valerie. Robert died before they could press charges against him, but they considered his letters a full confession of his crimes. The FDLE preserved samples of his hair, blood, and DNA in case they were to ever need it to match to any of their cases in the future. Many people were glad there wasn't a trial. Shirley told a childhood friend of Megan named Margaret McDaniel how she felt. In one word, closure. Megan and Cherish lived their lives together and died side by side. That special bond that they had was never broken, even though the hearts of so many of their loved ones were, and they can never be mended. They wanted to note that Cherish's mom did pass away in 1997, just 5 years following her daughter's murder. Megan's family also saw another tragedy. Her brother, John Clark Carr III, who went by Clark, was found dead in a burning house in Thomasville, Georgia. His family found him shortly after 6 p.m. Saturday, September 28, 2013. They went there to look for him after he could not be contacted. He was 44 years old at the time, and his body was found on the dining room floor near the back door. The fire seemed to be set on purpose, using an accelerant. An autopsy was said to have been conducted, and they were going to release the results, but I could never find any more information about this. Megan's mom and dad lost both of their children. Clark left behind his wife Renee and a child named Taylor. Megan's mom Shirley passed in 2016. I just want to thank you so much for giving these victims your time, for getting to know them, for spending your time here, and helping me continue to let their memories live on forever. It's a dream come true. A family vacation to the most magical place on earth, Disney World. Two teenagers, Christian and Michelle, have been waiting for this trip forever. It was the first vacation they'd ever been on in their entire life. They could have never imagined it would also be their last. This is their story. I'm sure that you will learn something new because today I have the pleasure of introducing you to the Rogers family. But before they became four, I have to take you back in time to introduce you to the couple who came together to form this family, Joan Netzler and Hal Rogers. Both of them grew up on farms out in rural Ohio, Middle America, the heartland, Van Wert County to be exact. This is a small community. Hal and Joan grew up there in the 1950s, and farm life was all they knew. Joan May Netzler, known as Jo, was born on November 12, 1952. As a farmer's daughter, she was taught from a very early age the importance of hard work and determination, and she developed a strong work ethic that she held throughout her life. Though farming is a very serious and very dirty job, Jo still had a fun and girly side. She was known to dress up her cat in baby clothes and take it around in a stroller throughout town. It definitely got the attention of the townspeople, and that made sense for someone like Jo because she would find this to be fun. She was very outgoing and charismatic, and people said she never knew a stranger because she would talk to everyone and anyone everywhere she went. That was probably just fine when you grow up in a place where everyone knows your name, a place where no one was a stranger. The main town nearby is called Wilshire, and although it's only one L different from Wilshire in Los Angeles, it's a world apart in every way. The population in 2010 was under 400 people, and it was the same back when Hal and Jo were growing up there. It's only about a half a mile from the Ohio-Indiana state line, and it's under 1 square mile of land. I went on Google Maps, and as of now in Wilshire, aside from land and a small number of homes, I found a cemetery, a sewage plant, a fire department, a grocery store, a tiny little post office that has been there since 1822, and other than that, just a handful of stores. That's it. Jo didn't get out much. As you can probably imagine, there wasn't much to do besides help her family on the farm and abide by their rules, which they definitely had. Jo was sheltered. Her family had strong religious and moral beliefs, ones that would make it difficult for Jo to have things her way and enjoy milestones in her life later on. It didn't stop her, though, from being her own person. She was fun and adventurous. She loved country music and dancing, and she was strikingly beautiful. She stood out, especially to one guy in her high school, Crestview Junior-Senior High School. His name was Hal Rogers. He was 1 year ahead of her, and quite the looker himself, but he had something else, a quality that made him even more desirable. He was a hard worker, and that was very important to Jo. Would he be the type of man that could support a family? Indeed, he was. He was following in his father's footsteps, learning the ropes as a farmer, and he was set to take over the family business, which looked good on him, especially to Jo. Hal was the shy, quiet type. He kept his head down and worked hard. When Jo and Hal got together, it was more like opposites attracting than anything else. Jo brought out Hal's lighter side. She would force him to listen to her favorite music and drag him onto the dance floor with her. She would write him love letters and make sure he would sing along to her favorite songs, in between begging him to please take them out to dinner so they could get away from the mundane routine of farm life. Hal was smitten from the first moment he laid eyes on Jo. He said it himself. He called her his green-eyed girl. He knew she was the one. He just felt it. In just 4 months after Joe graduated, the couple was getting married. There could have been more than one reason for that, because Joe was pregnant. Even though they were both adults at the time, Joe's parents were actually embarrassed about the entire thing. Their teenage daughter had gotten pregnant from premarital relations, and now she was having what was referred to as a shotgun wedding. If you've heard that colloquialism but don't know why they say it, I didn't know either for a while. It refers to the father of the pregnant bride-to-be pretty much threatening the reluctant groom with a shotgun in order to make sure he goes through with the wedding because he knocked up their daughter. So there you have it. Joe's parents were not thrilled, to say the least. The wedding was held in a church, as was customary, except Joe was robbed of what many brides look forward to on this special day, the opportunity to wear a beautiful white gown. Apparently, Joe didn't deserve to have a white wedding. When you weren't seen as pure back then, white just wasn't fitting. Still, to go one step further, Joe's parents didn't allow her to wear a wedding dress at all, no matter what color it was. It was forbidden. On top of that, they prohibited Joe from having any guests at the reception. So much for celebrating a happy union with the man that you love, the soon-to-be father of your first child. However, the newlyweds did get to celebrate with one another. They got to go on a honeymoon for one single solitary weekend in Fort Wayne, Indiana, at a hotel called Hospitality Inn. It may not have been much to many, but for them, it was probably a nice little getaway, even though it was just across the border, only 40 minutes away. But after they returned, it was back to reality, and that meant getting ready to welcome their first child into the world. This is how they became the Rogers family. Michelle Lee Rogers was born on February 22, 1972, and for the next 2 years, she would be Hal and Joe's world. Once they became parents, their biggest concern was providing for their growing family because another bundle of joy came along soon after, little Christy Eugenia Rogers, born on October 6, 1974. Now they had 2 daughters under 3 years old, and I'm sure you can imagine how hard it is to take on all of that, especially as newlyweds and new parents. But Hal and Joe were prepared as much as they could be. Joe was a strong-willed woman. She would even stand up to her husband if she thought that he was in the wrong. She definitely had her own independent thoughts and opinions. She may have looked like she could be pushed around, considering she was thin in stature, but this woman was resilient and determined. Together, she and Hal made the decision to become dairy farmers to support their family. By 1976, Hal purchased the exact farmland where he grew up from his father. His father sold it to him and his brother John. Thus, Hal became a second-generation farmer. It was a 300-acre plot of land just 3 miles outside of Wilshire. The Rogers resided in one of the trailers on the property, and Hal's younger brother John lived in one as well. He was part owner and helped out on the farm, and they needed all the help they could get. Next, they needed cows, and soon they had more than you could count. This was a huge undertaking. Dairy farming is not an easy task, but there was a boom in rural America around this time in the 1970s. Dairy products like milk and cheese were in high demand, and therefore, farmers would purchase female cows who they could use to acquire milk. But not only do dairy farmers have to account for each cow and make sure they're healthy, they've also got to keep track of their reproduction schedules and go through the entire milking process. They also have to know how to do business with the companies that want to purchase the milk products. Once the cows can no longer lactate, they even have the choice to have them sold to slaughterhouses. And you probably know what that means. Back then, this was an honorable way to make a decent living. It's a big business, even on a smaller scale like the Rogers had. Over the years, they grew their farm to 80 cows, and both Joe and Hal were hands-on. They taught Michelle and Christy everything they could. Michelle, being the firstborn and the older of the two, took on more and more responsibilities as she grew up. By elementary school, she was spending a lot of time on the farm. She and her sister loved animals. Michelle enjoyed being surrounded by the cows, and as a matter of fact, she named all 80 of them. Unlike many others, she could actually tell them apart. She cared about them, They were more than milk-producing mammals. They were her pets. Hal was used to just numbering his cows, but because of Michelle, he got used to using their names, even calling one of them by the nickname Crazy. Michelle's favorite cow was one that she named Sage, which is actually one of my niece's names. There was also Rosie, Betty, and a cow named Grandpa. Others were named after months, like April, May, and June. When Michelle was still a little younger, a preteen, her farm responsibilities included helping her father groom, feed, and take the cows for walks. Michelle had her mother's looks. She was like a little Joe, a twin of Joe, with very delicate features, big brown eyes, brown hair, and a soft smile. However, she was more like her father when it came to her demeanor. She was quiet and more reserved compared to her sister Christy, who took after Hal in looks, but was more carefree and outgoing, and strong-willed like her mama. I know they say that parents shouldn't pick favorites, but it was really easy to see who Hal's favorite was. It was Christy, the baby of the family, and he'd admit it too. Her charm worked on everyone, including her papa. Everywhere she went, she kept that cute, almost mischievous smirk on her face, and her energy would just draw people in. Though the sisters were opposites, they had one thing in common: they were both Rogers. As they got older, they became popular at school. They were attending the same junior-senior high school as their parents did, Crestview. Michelle was known for her beauty. People who knew her said it was hard not to do a double take when she passed by, and to some this may be a positive, but for a girl like Michelle, she would rather just have her head in a book and not be bothered. Christy, on the other hand, doesn't it always happen this way? She couldn't be ignored. She was involved in everything. She basked in the attention. She loved to roller skate, ride on a scooter, play softball. She was even a catcher at one point. Her friends would actually go and watch these games, and they commented about her fearlessness. There were times when the umpire would actually have to remind Christy to leave some distance between herself and the batters. She just couldn't contain her excitement. That's who she was. She was also definitely more of the athletic one of the sisters, and at times self-conscious, especially when she got into her teens. She was shorter than average for her age. She was only 5 feet 1 inch. And that bothered her, so she purposely started to use a lot of Aquanet, a lot of hairspray, and build up her hair so that she could be a few inches taller than she was. But who didn't in the 80s? That was a look back then. I know I did it. I'm only 4 feet 11 inches, and my bangs would scrape the skies so that I could look taller. The crispier the hair, the better back then. Not one strand would even move out of place. Christy liked being the center of attention, and she didn't care who was watching. She would even practice her cheerleading moves in front of the cows, and it was quite a funny sight to see. Hal would joke that if the cows weren't running away, Christy must have been doing something right. She truly was the apple of her father's eye. She followed him around everywhere he went. Before she could join in with all the chores, Christy would just sit under a tree with her little toys and a coloring book and watch her daddy as he was milking the cows and plowing the field. Soon, Hal realized he had a mini-me, so he began bringing cool things around that Christy would like. Her favorite snacks, things to keep her entertained and content while he was doing his work. Then he would stop every now and then and show his daughter every detail about what he was doing, and she took mental notes. This is how they developed a very strong bond together. Even though both of Hal's daughters meant the world to him, he would say in regard to Christy, "There ain't nothing about it. That's just my little girl." As I explained, Michelle was more withdrawn, and considering Hal was the same way, it was hard for them to bond as much. Neither one of them broke out of their shell. Michelle preferred being alone and doing her own thing, and that was okay with Hal because he cherished the moments he spent with both of his girls, who he referred to as his princesses. But if you got a peek into their world from the inside, it was nothing like that of royalty. It could even look like Michelle and Christy were more like servants or employees. Though it was routine for both of them, this was their daily life. It was a lot of work. By the time the girls were in junior high school, they were doing everything that both their parents did on the farm. They would wake up at 5 a.m. to begin the milking process, and most times it was in freezing cold weather. They had to shovel manure, wash the cows, and get them ready for the milking parlor. I learned that the milking parlor is a structure designed to mass milk cows, rather than milk them by hand. They're milked by a machine. But it's still a lot of work. You have to corral the cows together, get them inside their own little stalls, and attach these devices to the udders so that they can be mechanically milked. Imagine the smell, the sounds, the splashes of milk, the gooey mud, and even the manure making its way from your head to your feet, all before the sun came up. It would take a good 2 to 3 hours before this process was over. There was no sleeping in for the girls. This was all they knew. It was wake up by the crack of dawn and get moving, no matter how tired they were, day in and day out. Here's a picture of Michelle in the milking parlor, and to me, you can just tell how much went into this process. I watched some videos on it too. Afterward, there was more to do. You had to clean everything to start over at 3 o'clock. This was the girls' morning routine, before school even started every day. Joe had been doing this for years before the girls pitched in. Before they came along, it was Joe doing the bulk of this work with Hal and his brother John. Everything from caring for the cows, milking them, sometimes by hand before they had the parlor, and even breeding them. They actually owned a bull at one point. But this was all too much in between harvesting crops, making sure the field was in order, and keeping all the machinery working and in good condition. And don't forget the regular household duties like cooking and cleaning. So they ended up resorting to impregnating the cows with an artificial insemination process, which took the burden off of them. Here's a picture that I want to show you of Joe in 1986. She's waiting for lumber to be delivered so they could build a new barn. She was tiny but mighty. However, with more mouths to feed when the girls came along, it just got harder. Joe had to get a job outside the farm to bring in extra income and to maintain health insurance for her entire family. She began working at a place called Peyton's Northern, a distribution center that's still around today, located in Bluffton, Indiana, over the Ohio-Indiana border, about a 24-minute straight shot from Wilshire. It's actually the supply chain for Kroger grocery stores. It was hard work for Joe. Joe drove a forklift, moved items around the warehouse, assembled packages, and worked the overnight shift. That way she could go back to the farm in the early morning hours and resume her work milking the cows. Every morning she would return home from Peyton Northern and complete all of her work. She would then help the girls get ready for school. After that, she would accompany her husband for breakfast on the back of his Honda Goldwing motorcycle. That was a little fun they had together. They liked doing that. It was routine for them. They would go into Wilshire after the girls got on the bus. When they finally got back home, though, Joe would go straight to bed before waking up and doing more chores around the house, getting ready for the girls to come home from school, followed by more milking and farm work, as well as cooking, cleaning, and her everyday chores like laundry. She would finally get a nap in before taking that 24-minute drive to the distribution center in the middle of the night. This routine was okay at first, but it became too much for Joe. Everyone could tell that she was exhausted, if it wasn't obvious by the fact that she would literally fall asleep standing up while milking the cows. It was clear when she would even take naps during her lunch breaks. Her co-workers stared in disbelief. They felt bad for her. By the time she was 35, she looked strikingly different from her senior picture before she and Hal got married. She had aged significantly. People who knew her said that she looked at least a decade older than her age. By this time, she was suffering from migraines. She had dark circles under her eyes. Her face looked worn and gaunt, even in 1986, in this picture of her relaxing on the couch. I don't know if you can tell, but she just looks like she needs a break. Honestly, she hadn't had one in so long. That honeymoon was the last getaway she was on. But Joe was always on the go. She had her farm and her work responsibilities, church every Sunday at Zion Lutheran, and she was also a very attentive mother. She would drive the girls to and from all their activities. Michelle was in 4-H, She went to all the meetings and contests. For Christy, it was softball and cheerleading camp. Jo was so tired that she would even fall asleep driving. Her neighbor and good friend Rosemary was vocal about the way Jo was running herself into the ground. She told her, "Listen, you're killing yourself, and you're killing me by having to watch." She just wanted Jo to take some time for herself, but Jo loved her daughters and her family, and nothing would stop her. She was the type of mom that made sure her girls were dressed perfectly for events like picture day. She even took out an ad in a newspaper for Michelle's 16th birthday. Here it is, just as it appeared on that special day. It reads, "Sweet 16 Michelle," with a picture of her and the words Mom, Dad, and Christy underneath. I haven't really said too much about what Michelle was going through all these years and what she was like by this time. Well, she looks childlike in this picture. Sometimes she looked younger for her age. On days when she didn't wear makeup, she could even pass for a preteen. But then on other days when she was dolled up, she could pass for much older. She had become more and more withdrawn as she got closer to age 17. Her teachers would mention she was an average student who spent more time talking in class and flirting with boys than paying attention to the lessons. As much as she was known for being quiet, she developed a wild side as she got older. She spent a lot of time partying. She would smoke cigarettes, drink beer, and she loved wine coolers. Her circle of friends was mostly guys she had met through her agriculture club in 4-H. She would be seen at the back of the bus in the mornings on the way to school, with a mouthful of bazooka bubblegum and wearing pink-rimmed eyeglasses. She did not need corrective lenses. She just loved the way they made her look. She would be chatting and laughing with the boys, sometimes even sitting in one of the guys' laps. There were times when they would be making some pretty rude jokes and even grabbing Michelle's butt. She didn't seem to care though, and it appeared as typical teenage behavior, being a little rebellious. On the weekends, you could find Michelle in the passenger seat of a car with a guy she was seeing, just letting her hair blow in the wind as they drove through the city, listening to Guns N' Roses and jamming out to U2. Michelle even really liked Madonna as well, but it wasn't easy for her at that age. In high school, kids gossip, and Michelle ended up being at the center of a lot of rumors, mostly about her being promiscuous, or at least that she seemed to be. But Michelle was tough. She would laugh it off and move on. However, on the inside, Michelle wasn't handling it very well. She felt alone, and she would frequently tell her close friends she wanted to leave the farm. She wanted to go to college, become a veterinarian, and other times she would say, "You know what? I would miss it if I left all of this behind. Everything I know." She would teeter back and forth between never wanting to set foot on a farm again to wanting to meet the man of her dreams and raise a family on a farm of her own. Family meant a lot to her. Even when she was being a little angsty teen, she would still make time for family. Her and Christy, they would constantly argue like siblings do. They would argue about who would do what chores, who would get to use the phone, who would wear a certain outfit, just typical sibling rivalry. But Michelle was still very protective of her little sister, and she needed to be. Because Michelle knew something a little Christy didn't know, something Michelle never wanted her sister to find out. Michelle had a secret, a big one. She was hiding something that no teenager should ever have to keep. It would explain a lot once the truth was revealed, and soon the pieces would begin coming together. It was the spring of 1988. Michelle had only been 16 for about a month when sheriff deputies showed up at the farm asking for John Rogers, her uncle. Once they located him, he was arrested and taken away in handcuffs. No one knew what was going on. It was the first truly shocking event this poor family would have to endure, and I wish I could tell you it would be the last, but it wasn't. I haven't told you much about John. People called him odd. He would frequently wear army fatigues around town. He would brag about serving in the military, and he also said that he was an undercover agent. Of course, nobody believed him. A farmer who moonlighted in the CIA? No. Neither Christy nor Michelle seemed to like him very much. They kind of kept their distance. He spent most of his time in his own trailer with his girlfriend, who wasn't actually that much older than Michelle, maybe a year or two. But John was a grown man. He was in his late 20s or early 30s around this time. The young girl took a liking to him, and they were dating for a while until they weren't. They broke up a few months prior to his arrest, and at this point, the young woman was merely John's roommate and not his girlfriend anymore. She had recently been in an altercation that caused the police to come out to the farm and take statements. It was a horrendous ordeal. This poor woman reported that one evening, while she was getting back inside the trailer, she was attacked by a man wearing a mask. He jumped on her, blindfolded her, held her captive, and ultimately forced her to have intercourse with him. He held a knife to her and videotaped the entire thing. She could hear him inserting the VHS tape into the camera, and also heard his voice, which she said sounded familiar to her. She told the police she actually thought it was John himself, her ex-boyfriend, the man she lived with, Hal's brother, Michelle and Christy's uncle, a man who lived just yards away. On account of this accusation, John had been arrested. While those close to John, like Hal and Joe, didn't believe it, Hal immediately went down to the jail and bailed his brother out. However, the police got a warrant to search John's trailer and ended up finding a briefcase with a number of videotapes and audio cassettes inside. Once they played them, it proved the young woman was telling the truth. It was indeed John on those tapes, committing this disgusting act on the woman he used to say he cared about. He was arrested once again and in custody when Hal got a call for him and Joe to come down to the sheriff's office. What they were about to hear was more than unexpected. It was unbelievable. When the cops were going through the audio and videotapes, they realized the young woman who reported John wasn't the only one he was doing this to. They found pictures of another girl, one who appeared to be even younger than John's ex-girlfriend. She was bound, blindfolded, and unclothed. As these officers were taking a closer look, they realized she looked familiar. They thought it was Michelle, John's own niece. Mortified, the Rogers wanted proof, and they got it. Little Michelle was interviewed by the police, and this must have been a lot for her to go through. That's when she finally admitted that it was true. Her secret was out. Those pictures were of her. And that's not all. The police searched John's vehicle and obtained audio recordings of Michelle screaming during several of these horrifying and violating acts. It turned out that this had been going on since Michelle was only 14 years old. It was happening right under her parents' noses, right on their property. No wonder Michelle never wanted to step foot on another farm. This poor child kept the secret for so long, and she probably would have kept it hidden forever if it hadn't been for John's ex reporting him. That's a hell of a secret for a teenager to keep, for anyone to keep for that matter. It explains a lot about her demeanor, especially some of her rebellious ways the last couple of years. Michelle said that John told her he would kill her if she ever opened her mouth about what he had done. Here's a picture of Michelle, at only 2 years old, playing as her Uncle John laughs in the background. Who would have known she was living with a monster? Well, now everyone close to Michelle knew, including her house parents. And sadly, house mom Irene, Michelle's grandma, chose not to believe that her son John was capable of doing such a thing. No matter what evidence was presented to her, she refused to take Michelle's side. Instead, she called Michelle a liar and would tell anyone who would listen that Michelle was making it all up. Can you imagine that for a minute? This is why a lot of people don't come forward. They believe that people will think they're lying. John denied everything. He insisted he was just being framed. Well, enough was enough. Hal cut his mother off, and of course his brother as well. It really caused a rift in the Rogers family. At this point, he also put something else together. Somehow the family dog that Michelle absolutely adored had been found dead not too long before this. For the life of him, he couldn't figure out how it could have happened, but looking back, he knew the truth. He knew John had done this as a warning to Michelle that if she opened her mouth, he really would kill her. And that's terrifying. In Hal's own words, he said, "If I would have known what John was doing, I would have killed the son of a..." Those are some strong words, but he meant it. He would do anything to protect his precious daughters, and he wished he could have done something, but he failed. That depressed him. He was a shell of himself for a long time after all this played out. It was strange. He would actually lock himself in John's trailer for hours on end. Sometimes he was in there for days, and no one could talk to him, not even Joe. It seemed like he didn't have the right words to express what he felt inside. He was a husk of himself. This went on for quite some time, and Michelle became even more withdrawn as well, for a while anyway. She never talked about what happened. She was offered therapy but refused to go. It seemed like she just wanted to move on and not let this be part of her identity, but it showed through. One of her teachers at Crestview noticed she wouldn't open up at all in social studies. Michelle would even write in the tiniest handwriting, so small that all of her quiz answers would be crammed into just 1/4 side of the page. All that changed, though. As time passed, Michelle did start to come out of her shell, and in the spring of 1989, during her junior year, Michelle's handwriting began to change. It was large and bold, and she would fill up entire pages with her words. Something had changed indeed. Her uncle pleaded no contest to the charges related to the case involving his ex-girlfriend, and he was sentenced to up to 25 years in prison. It seemed as though Michelle could finally breathe again. She never went through with a legal process in pursuing charges against her uncle. I'm not sure why, but I could probably guess. So eventually, the charges were dropped. He was already imprisoned, so maybe it seemed pointless. Maybe she didn't want to put her and her family through the agony of going forward with the claims. She even went to prom that year, and although she was no longer close to her father's parents, she was still very close to her maternal grandmother. She even stopped by her house to show off her beautiful prom dress. Michelle was 17, and she was in a more serious relationship with a guy named Jeff Feasby. They met in the 7th grade, but they got together at a prom after party. They'd always been friends, but that night they talked forever until the sun came up. They just knew there was something more there, and after just a couple of weeks, they made it official, with Jeff giving Michelle his class ring to wear. It was an outward expression of their commitment. She would only take it off when she worked on the farm. She was just so scared that she would drop it and lose it, so she would pop it into her purse for safekeeping. By this time, as a junior in high school, Michelle had more concrete goals than she ever had before. She knew she wanted to go to college and major in agriculture, so maybe she was going to settle for a little bit of both, getting away from the farm for a while, but studying to know how to run one of her own one day, or use the knowledge she already knew to do something more innovative in agriculture. She still had another year to decide. Christy, on the other hand, only being 14, wasn't allowed to have a boyfriend, and she probably really didn't want one anyway. She seemed to try hard not to be anything like her older sister, though. She seemed to always live in her shadow, no matter how loud and outgoing she tried to be. In 1989, she was just finishing up 8th grade. The junior and senior high schools were on the same campus, so Michelle and Christy saw each other every day. They even rode the same bus to school, but they couldn't be more different. Christy was always with the girls, unlike Michelle, who gravitated toward the guys. In fact, Christy was not interested in boys at all. She would make it known that she was not like Michelle. You couldn't make rude jokes with her or grab her rear end. She wouldn't stand for it. Michelle's boyfriend called Christy a little ball of fire because she was feisty. She was kind of determined not to go with the flow, and by this time, she wasn't exactly bright-eyed and bushy-tailed in the morning for the cow milking shifts. Hal would tell people that you would have to get her out of bed with a stick of dynamite, and being the baby of the family, she got away with it more. It was hard for Michelle not to feel a little jealous, especially since Christy had become more popular than her sister at school, and clearly at home as well. Nevertheless, throughout everything Michelle went through with her uncle, she made sure he never heard her little sister. She went out of her way to make sure that Christy was never left alone with him, ever. All along, Christy never had a clue about the sacrifices Michelle made in order to protect her, until years later, when everything was revealed. Shifting gears back to the present, it was 1989. The end of the school year was coming up, and Joe had vacation days to use. Hal came up with a plan for a family vacation, the first one they would ever go on. Who knows why Hal thought the timing was right. Maybe it was to escape the living hell that the family had just gone through finding out what happened to Michelle. Maybe to get away from the interrogations, the allegations, the stares from the townspeople, and do anything but talk to one more professional authority figure or counselor. The girls were excited. It was the very first time they would go anywhere outside their hometown. The most fun these girls had was visiting the county fair every year. This was going to be big, their dream vacation, a once-in-a-lifetime event. If they only knew how true that really was. They got to planning as soon as Joe broke the news. At first, they thought it would be fun to visit Gatlinburg for a relaxing stay in the mountains of Tennessee or Gettysburg. But then an even better idea came to light. Disney World. It seemed like a world away, 1,000 miles, but they wanted to put their toes in the sand of the beach and meet Mickey Mouse for the very first time. And they deserved it. As soon as school was out, the family was going to make their way by car in their two-door, 1986 sky blue Oldsmobile Calais coupe from Ohio to the beautiful Florida coastline. It was a straight shot down Interstate 75. They'd go through Kentucky, Tennessee, and Georgia along the way. It would take about 16 hours to get there, so they decided they'd probably drive to Georgia and stay in a hotel, then make their way into Florida the next day. They were so excited. The girls would not stop talking about it, planning every detail. The sightseeing, the tourist attractions, the theme parks, and where they would stay along the way. They had about a week to cram in as much as they could. They decided that they were going to set off on May 26th and return to the farm by June 4th, giving themselves a couple of days to drive to and from, spending time in between having as much fun as they could. However, Hal had some bad news. As it got closer to the time they were supposed to leave, Hal realized that without his brother John at the farm, there wouldn't be anyone to take care of the daily duties. Not only that, the weather that spring was unpredictable. It was unusually wet and rainy, which delayed the harvest of corn and wheat. It was normally already planted by this time of year. Hal said they'd either need to reschedule the vacation or he'd have to stay back and work on the farm. Of course, this was disappointing. It was a lose-lose situation. Either Hal would miss out on making memories with his family, or they'd have to delay the entire trip, which could mean they wouldn't get another chance for a while. Maybe never. After some thought, Hal insisted that the girls go without him. He knew that they deserved this trip. He'd say that Joe worked harder than he did. She needed this vacation. With everything that had just happened in regard to Michelle and his brother John, he wanted the girls to experience some joy in their lives. It was settled. Hal would stay back and the girls would leave as planned on May 26th. The night before, on Thursday the 25th, Joe devoted herself to getting everything ready. As she still went to work her midnight shift. Then she came back to the farm as per usual, fulfilling her morning duties, and then she got some rest. Meanwhile, Michelle and Christy were excited. They were preparing everything they needed, packing, and couldn't wait to get on the road for their vacation. Michelle got a chance to see her boyfriend Jeff the previous night as well. He came out to the farm to say goodbye. Michelle was going to be gone for his birthday, and it was the first time this young couple would be apart, so they wanted to get in that one last kiss goodbye. Michelle told Jeff that she'd try to give him a call and fill him in on what they were doing along the way once she got settled into their hotel. On Friday afternoon, May 26, 1989, the Rogers trio was off on their magical Florida vacation. Now a girls' trip, they brought along their Nikon one-touch camera and several rolls of Kodak film to document every moment. In those days, these types of cameras required 35mm film rolls. Some of you may know and some of you may not, but these would have to be developed at a photo shop after they were used up. Then, another canister would be inserted inside. Each canister had about 24 exposures, which was just 24 chances at the perfect picture. But unlike digital cameras, you couldn't see the results until after the photos were developed. I remember those days. It was fun to get all your pictures back and find out just how many were really good and how many were bad. They started out at 1 p.m. on May 26th. They said goodbye to Hal, who was out in the field feeding the cows. Joe was driving. She stuck her head out of the driver's side window, gave him a kiss goodbye, and he said, "Have a good time." Joe responded with, "We'll be back," and they were off. One of the daughters was in the front seat, most likely Michelle, the older of the two, because she would have been assisting Joe with the navigation, which in 1989 meant reading paper maps and a road atlas. Another one of the girls would have been in the back, taking in the sights and sounds of the road. After about 575 miles and 7 hours later, they made their final stop at a Best Western hotel off the highway in Dalton, Georgia. They even visited a gift shop where they purchased a few souvenirs, including a salt and pepper shaker with a rainbow and the word Georgia on it, the first of many cute gifts they bought to memorialize their trip. The next morning, on Saturday, May 27th, they got an early start and made it to Jacksonville, Florida. They didn't waste any time. They drove straight to Jacksonville Zoo, their first real attraction. This made sense as the girls loved animals, and they spent the whole afternoon looking at many they had probably never seen in person before. They made sure to take a lot of pictures of monkeys, giraffes, lions, and more. After they had their fill of the day, they checked into the Days Inn Hotel for the night. On Sunday morning, May 28th, they headed south to Ocala to visit a destination called Silver Springs State Park. Silver Springs is the largest artesian spring in the world. It's also the oldest commercial tourist attraction in Florida. It's known for its glass-bottom boat experience, which is very cool. It's a 30-minute tour on a boat with a glass bottom, so you can look down and see the fish, manatees, and all the underwater life. It would have been the very first time the Rogers women had ever been on a boat. As a matter of fact, Joe never learned how to swim, and neither Michelle nor Christy was even good at it. At most, they could wade in the shallow water, but anything that required swimming would have taken more skills than they had. This boating experience was safe, though. It didn't require you to do more than just sit, relax, and take in the experience. Here are a few pictures of people doing just that. The girls took pictures of the experience, including a bunch of wild monkeys at this park. Then they traveled up the East Coast to Titusville, where they got a room at the Quality Inn close to Kennedy Space Center. This is a very famous tourist attraction where NASA space shuttles and rockets launch. At this point, I really think they probably tried to get a good night's sleep because the next day, on Monday, May 29th, was the first day they would spend in the magical city of Orlando, Florida, home to Disney World. It's definitely not a theme park you can see in one day. They actually planned to spend the next few days going to each park, like MGM, Epcot Center, Pleasure Island, and more. The girls were headed right to International Drive, which is a famous stretch of highway packed with attractions, hotels, and restaurants. It's a tourist's dream. Joe had a Quest International discount card for 50% off a $60 room at the Gateway Inn. This was a 2-story motel with a mini golf course out front, and it was close to everything. Once they got settled in, Joe wrote a postcard back home to Hal. She told him all about their adventures and how much fun they were having, but how exhausted she was from running around at 36 years old with 2 energetic teenagers. She wrote about how they spent the night in Titusville the night before, and how they were leaving for SeaWorld, then Disney for the next 3 nights. She told Hal about the weather, how it was humid, very high, she said 89%, and she wrote, "Kids are having a great time dragging me everywhere. Saw Silver Springs and went on the glass-bottom boat." At the end of the postcard, she wrote, "Better go get Christy out of bed. Love ya, take care, don't work too hard. Michelle." Michelle also sent out a postcard, not to her dad, but to her boyfriend Jeff. Remember, it was Jeff's birthday in a few days, and Michelle chose a pretty cute but funny card. It was a postcard with a bikini-clad woman on all fours, with her rear end right near the open jaws of a huge gator. It was cheeky, and it said "Fun times in Florida," which was completely fitting, I must say. Michelle wrote, "Hi, how's everything with you? I'm doing great. Yesterday we went to the zoo in Jacksonville. I was visiting my relatives and I found Jeffrey. Later, we went to Silver Springs and rode on a glass-bottom boat. Today, we're going to the beach and then to SeaWorld. You have fun at work and behave yourself. Have a great birthday. I'll be thinking of you. I miss you. Love you, Shell. That was the plan. They went out to experience SeaWorld and spend time getting some sun at the beach, taking pictures the entire time, going through rolls and rolls of film, capturing every moment they could, just taking it all in and having the time of their lives. On Tuesday, May 30th, they went to the Magic Kingdom. It was their first day at Disney. Wednesday, the 31st, was Epcot. By Thursday, June 1st, they were leaving their hotel for their next stop, Tampa. At this point, Christy sent out a postcard to a friend of hers. It said, "Hey honey, I hope you're having fun. Not bad here, very hot. Heard it was cool there. We went to the zoo, Silver Springs, Disney, MGM, SeaWorld, and Epcot. Talk to you soon." At the bottom, she added something cute. "Great looking guys. I'll tell you about them, Chris." They plan to visit Busch Gardens next, which I'd say is a must-see for vacationers. It has roller coasters, animals, a food and wine festival, and a lot of fun shows. They arrived at the Days Inn at Rocky Point at 12:30 p.m. Man checked in. They had a nice room on the second floor. It was a basic room with tropical decor, 2 double beds, and room 251. From their balcony was a view of the parking lot, but beyond that, they could see Tampa Bay, and it was beautiful. The first thing Michelle did was call Jeff. It was around 12:37 p.m. because it was his birthday, and she promised she would call to wish him a happy birthday and to catch up on all the awesome things they were doing in Florida. Jeff had been working at the time, and Michelle had actually scheduled a delivery of flowers and balloons to the gas station where he worked. That's just the type of person she was. She was excited to ask him, "Hey, did you receive your gifts?" Although Jeff was a little bashful about getting such an outward display of affection, he was very appreciative. The lovebirds talked for about 10 minutes, with Christy and Joe saying hi in the background, and Michelle telling Jeff their plans for the day. She said that she really wanted to go to the beach, but Joe was being difficult because she was worried about them being too close to the ocean with such deep waters. This was one of the last days they would spend in Florida, and they planned to be back on the farm by either Saturday or Sunday at the latest. Joe had to be back to work for her midnight shift on Monday, and Hal was anxiously waiting for their return. But that's the thing. By Sunday night, the girls were still not back in Ohio. At first, Hal didn't think much of it. Maybe they were running behind. It was their very first trip like this. Maybe they were tired and would probably make it back sometime in the middle of the night. But by Monday morning, there was still no sign of them. Hal started to become concerned. Joe was a dedicated worker. She would never miss a shift without giving notice. If she was planning to be gone longer, she would have called Hal to let him know. At this point, Hal was sure that they must have been in a car accident. There just would not be any other reason that they wouldn't be back. So Hal began to call Joe's friends and family to see if anyone had heard from her, but everyone said they had not. Hal was concerned and went down to the local Van Wert Sheriff's Office and also contacted the Ohio Highway Patrol. He wanted to see if any accidents had been reported, but there weren't any. Meanwhile, Jeff kept calling the farmhouse, asking if Michelle was home yet. Hal was increasingly worried and relayed the message to Jeff that no, the girls had not returned. That's when Jeff explained he had just received a postcard from Michelle. It took that long to get there, and Hal wanted to see it in case it was something written that could guide them to where the women went. Jeff went over, and they both looked over the postcard for anything that stood out, but nothing did. By Wednesday, June 7th, Hal decided he would somehow have to retrace their path. Maybe he would find their car off on the side of the road with the girls stranded. He felt helpless. He was trying to formulate a plan. He didn't know what to do, but what Hal didn't know was that he was about to get a visit from a police officer and finally get some answers. But before I get to that, I've got to go back a few days and 1,000 miles. It was early in the morning on Sunday, June 4th, in Tampa, Florida. The weather was perfect for boating on the bay. A pleasure boat named Amber Waves was going underneath the Bob Graham Sunshine Skyway Bridge when one of the occupants saw something in the water that caught their eye. This bridge itself has a history, and it's not full of sunshine, like the name suggests. It's located on the lower Tampa Bay and connects St. Petersburg, Florida, with another part of Florida. This is a big bridge. It's 4 miles long, 430 feet high, and 94 feet wide. It consists of 4 traffic lanes and has those cables in the center of the bridge. It's got a dark history. The current bridge was opened in 1987, but the first version, which was a little smaller though still very large, opened on September 6, 1954. However, just 9 years before the second version was opened, the original bridge partially collapsed. It happened on May 9, 1980, after a boat struck one of its beams. 35 people plunged into Tampa Bay and died. There was only one survivor. That is horrifying, but there's even more dark history related to this bridge. It's estimated that at least 316 people have died by jumping from the current bridge or its predecessor into Tampa Bay waters. Other people are suspected of jumping from the bridge to their deaths, but they've never been confirmed because their bodies have never been found due to the hard number of self-inflicted attempts on this bridge. Florida installed 6 crisis hotline phones and began a 24-hour patrol in 1999. But on that June day in 1989, a decade earlier, something was in the water under that bridge. Someone on that boat yelled, "It looks like a body." At around 9:15 a.m., they radioed the Coast Guard right away. The Amber Waves continued to circle this object until the Coast Guard arrived on the scene 23 minutes later. At around 9:39 a.m., the captain wanted to make sure that this object wouldn't get carried away by the current. It didn't take long for authorities to realize this was not a mannequin. It was a human body. It was floating face down in the water. Nearly all of the bodies that are pulled from Tampa Bay have been drowned swimmers or victims of boating accidents. So it was assumed that this victim could have possibly jumped from the bridge or fallen overboard on a boat. It's tragic either way. However, once one of the 4 crew members from the Coast Guard was able to retrieve the body from the water, he realized that this was something entirely different. It was murder. How did he know? It was evident by the yellow rope that was tied around the victim's neck, and on the other end, a cement cinder block. He cut the rope to release the body from the makeshift anchor. Had the weather been cooler, this body might have sunk to the bottom of the bay, never to be found. But the hot summer sun heated up the water, causing the body to become full of gases as it decomposed, making it rise to the surface, cinder block and all. It was a devastating discovery. It was obvious that the body was female. She had no clothing on below the waist. Her hands were tied behind her back with the same yellow rope, and her feet were also tied together at the ankles. There was duct tape across her mouth. It was also apparent that the body had been in the water for quite some time, according to the bloating as well as the blackened discoloration. The female was unrecognizable, but it was believed that she could have been in her late 20s to early 30s. Homicide detective Jim Capel was called out to the scene. But before he arrived, the Coast Guard had been alerted again at 10:06 a.m. This time, a sailboat called the Susie had spotted something bobbing in the water to the north of where the body had been located, just 2 miles southwest of the pier. It couldn't be another body, could it? That's what the caller thought it was. But before the crew could go out there, they continued their mission to get the first body down to the station at St. Petersburg. By 10:38, just as Detective Capel was assisting the Coast Guard crew to retrieve the apparent second body, a third call came in from aboard the Charlie, just 200 yards away. They had just retrieved 2 more victims from the bay. This was unbelievable. What in the world was happening? How could there be 3 people killed the same way? They didn't know who these poor women were, but they could tell that all 3 of them had been murdered, and it seemed that they were all connected, because all 3 of them had the same yellow rope around their necks, the 30-pound cinder block on the opposite end to weigh them down, tape across their mouths, and their arms tied behind their backs with their feet tied together. The second and the third victims looked a bit younger than the first victim due to the type of jewelry they were wearing. Victim number 1 was dubbed Jane Doe 1. She was wearing one single gold wedding band. The second victim, Jane Doe number 2, who was also unclothed from the waist down, had a ring on every finger of her left hand and one ring on her ring finger of her right hand. She had actually managed to get one of her hands free from the ropes and start to remove the tape from her mouth. This indicated that she was alive when she was thrown into the water. Jane Doe number 3 had 3 colorful friendship bracelets on her left wrist, a friendship ring on her ring finger of her right hand, and a ring on her left ring finger. She was also naked from the waist down. Because of this, authorities believed that all 3 victims had been sexually battered. There was a full-blown search going on. Boats, helicopters, and divers were all involved. They were trying to make sure there weren't more bodies left behind. They also faced the challenge of the worst conditions for a crime scene: water, which washes away evidence. But the detectives and search teams were determined to find any clues they could. As the bodies were brought back to shore, they were photographed while officers tried to identify them, but they weren't carrying any forms of identification. They were only partially clothed. There was no way to determine who they were. They couldn't just take pictures of their faces and release them to the public because of the extreme decomposition, and they couldn't even do sketches because these individuals no longer looked like they used to. All of the Jane Does were transported to the medical examiner's office for autopsies. Fortunately, they were able to take their fingerprints, but when they ran them through the system, they did not get any hits. Here's what they knew so far. Jane Doe number 1, the one with the wedding band, had long brown hair and was wearing a black t-shirt. Jane Doe number 2, the one whose left hand had managed to get free, had long wavy brown hair and had a black shirt over a blue bikini top. Jane Doe number 3, the one with the 3 friendship bracelets, had medium-length golden brown hair and was wearing a peach-colored shirt. Because of the condition of the bodies and the fact that they had been submerged in the water, no DNA could be recovered to determine whether they had been victims of forced intercourse. However, that seemed to be the motive for this crime. The person or persons who did this had most likely thrown the women into the water to cover up what they had done to them. The cause of death was determined not to have been from blunt force trauma, shooting, or stabbing. There weren't any apparent marks on their bodies at all. It was really hard to pinpoint the exact cause of death, but the closest the medical examiner could come was to conclude that their deaths were caused by a lack of oxygen and that their bodies had been in the water for at least 3 days. However, they had water in their lungs, which usually signifies that they were alive when they went into the water and drowned. Because of the current in the water and the time they had spent there, as well as the rapid decomposition, it was hard to tell if water could have gotten into their lungs post-mortem. The next step in trying to identify them was to figure out where they went overboard. The Coast Guard had experts from the University of South Florida, marine science experts, who were able to use technology to pinpoint where the drop point was, according to the currents over the past week. Ultimately, it was determined that the bodies were too far from the shore to have been dropped from a dock or the shore itself. They believed that they were dropped from the middle of the bay or from the Gulf of Mexico. In simpler terms, they were dropped from a boat, not off a dock somewhere. This was a big lead. Now, detectives could try to search every marina in the area to find out if anyone had seen these 3 women on a boat at any point, but this would not be an easy task. Meanwhile, the media jumped on the story as soon as the news broke. By the next morning, a news conference was being held by the local police department. Here's the kind of unusual way the police displayed the jewelry to the public. They put it on foam food containers with hand-drawn pictures of the victims' hands, arms, and fingers. It worked well enough to get the information out there. The Tampa Tribune posted pictures of the women's jewelry, hoping that someone would recognize the items as belonging to a friend or family member. The article reported that nearly every lead the officers investigated had fallen through. At this point, someone in Tampa had found a pile of bloody clothing that seemed promising, but the police determined that those items had nothing to do with the murders. A sunken boat was discovered near where one of the bodies had been found. However, the owner came forward and told the detectives when this had happened, and according to when the detectives believed these 3 women were killed, it just didn't add up. They estimated that the women went into the water around Friday, June 2nd, so this man and his boat were cleared. Police reported that a tip came in from someone who said they saw 3 women hitchhiking. They asked anyone with information to come forward, but nobody did. It was odd, given the extensive media coverage, that no one was coming forward. 3 women, one seemingly married, going missing would certainly set off some alarm bells. The detectives began to think maybe these women were not from the area. Had they been on a pleasure cruise? Were they vacationing from out of town? They just didn't know, but it seemed more likely that they were not locals. By Tuesday, June 6th, detectives were trying to locate hotels where the women might have been staying. News outlets began reporting about this, and that's when a lead came in on June 8th. A maid came forward from a nearby Days Inn. She noticed that one of the rooms seemed abandoned. There were still women's belongings inside, but she had never seen the guests. It looked like they hadn't even used the room, only put their things inside, but never spent one night. The beds were still made, and everything was still in its place. The next day, she reported this to her manager, who then called the police. The room in question was 251 on the 2nd floor, and you already know who that room belonged to: the Rogers family. The police were given this information and were told that the room had been reserved by Mrs. Joan Rogers, with 2 additional guests accompanying her. The manager believed the 2 other guests were her daughters. This was their biggest lead yet. Officers from both Tampa and St. Petersburg were working this case due to the location where the bodies were found and where they went missing. The bodies were found in the waters of St. Petersburg, which is next to Tampa, separated by the bay, but the hotel they had checked into was in Tampa. So a task force of over 24 officers was assembled. Upon entering the hotel on Thursday, June 9th, officers found 3 suitcases, a purse on the table, and numerous other items scattered throughout. There were a lot of teen items, clothing, balloons, a ton of brochures from various tourist locations like Jacksonville Zoo, SeaWorld, and bags from Disney World, along with various souvenirs. It was a sad sight to see. It was like everything was frozen in time. There had been no signs of guests. No one had slept in the beds. The shower and bath had not been used. The towels were dry, and no other items were disturbed. Room 251 was searched for prints and inspected, with all the belongings bagged and numbered as evidence. When a fingerprint technician arrived at the Days Inn, he was able to take fingerprints from an Oral-B Sesame Street toothpaste tube in the bathroom. He quickly compared those prints to the ones from the Jane Does, and the whole room went quiet when he shouted, "It's them." This discovery was chilling, especially with the presence of a pair of mini ears. Knowing what had happened to Michelle, Christy, and Joe was heart-wrenching. They truly deserved this vacation, but not what ultimately happened to them. The tragic events left many questions unanswered. How did all 3 of them end up in Tampa Bay, floating to the surface after being thrown overboard from a boat? At least one part of the mystery was solved. The 3 bodies found in the bay were indeed the guests who checked in on June 1st. After finding Joe's identification in her purse, they knew the trio was from Ohio. Detective Capel had to notify their family. He called the Van Wert Sheriff's Office back in Ohio and spoke to Officer Stan Owens, who knew the Rogers family well. Officer Owens was a close friend of the Rogers family. This was a small, close-knit community, and Officer Owens had actually been conducting his own search back in Ohio, calling around to different agencies across the state and elsewhere, trying to find out if anyone had seen Joan and her 2 daughters. Now, with the names of Jane Doe 2 and 3 identified as Michelle and Christy Rogers, the pieces were coming together. But the case was far from being solved. It only got more confusing and twisted from here. Officer Owens had to travel to Florida himself to deliver the heartbreaking news to Hal in person. It's difficult to imagine the gravity of such conversations. Hal would be left all alone, his younger brother imprisoned for the heinous acts done to his own daughter, who was now dead. Telling someone that their entire family was never coming back was unfathomable. As soon as Hal saw the sheriff's car pull up, he knew something was terribly wrong. Hal was not a man of many words, and it was no different when he received the news. He simply hung his head and shook it back and forth. It was too much to take in. He knew something must have happened, as Joe and the girls had kept in touch throughout their trip, either calling or sending postcards. But now there was radio silence since the weekend began. But no one could have imagined that they had been murdered. Hal helped with the official identification of his family members, providing their dental records to the Florida detectives. These records were ultimately used to make a concrete match to the bodies found in Tampa Bay. Back in Florida, crime scene technicians had collected several rolls of film, hoping these pictures might provide clues about what happened to the Rogers family. Back then, pictures even had dates on them, often burned into the bottom of the photo. This allowed them to establish a precise timeline of where Joe, Michelle, and Christy went each day. They also pulled phone records from the hotels, using that information to create a timeline. However, the camera was now missing, so clues about where the women went and who they were with on the day they were killed couldn't be determined from pictures. But they did have what they thought were some of the last pictures taken that day, which were very eerie. According to the information they gathered, it looked as though the Rogers checked into the Days Inn hotel around noon on June 1st. Phone records showed that Michelle called Jeff at 12:37 p.m. After that, records indicated that someone from the room made a call to Busch Gardens theme park. When they checked into the hotel, Joe had to get a parking pass, providing the hotel with her car's make, model, color, and license plate number. Investigators now had this information and were looking for the vehicle. They issued a bolo, "Be on the lookout," and interviewed anyone who had stayed at the hotel over the past week, from the day the women checked in until the present, including all vehicles registered to those guests. This was a full-blown investigation with no stone left unturned. Speaking of stones, remember the cinder blocks? Investigators analyzed the cement cinder blocks found at the end of the ropes tied around Michelle and Christy's necks. They did not have the block that was tied to Joe because it was cut off to pull her to shore. The two blocks they did have were of entirely different styles, so they had scientists test the cement to determine where they might have come from. But they had no luck. Since they knew the women had to have been on a boat, they sought information about any boats that could have been docked nearby or parked at the hotel on a trailer. This was a lot to piece together, as they had no idea what kind of boat they were looking for or how the women had gotten on it. But they were about to get a significant clue. They found the car. It didn't take long once they had the description. The location was close by and very chilling but also telling. The sky blue Oldsmobile Callis was found parked 3 miles away down Route 60 on Courtney Campbell Causeway. It's about a 6-minute drive from where their hotel would have been. To get there, all they had to do was turn left out of their hotel, make a slight left onto the causeway, then turn right and follow it for a couple of miles. They would see a ramp before they got to the bridge at a place called Sunset View on this causeway. This is where they would have set sail to get the best view. The car was parked approximately at this location, looking out to the water. Here's a picture of what the car looked like when it was found. Do you see what's in the back window? It's a little cow, a reminder of their life back on the farm. These girls just wanted to have fun and were having the time of their lives. They expected to see a pretty sunset when they parked their car at this boat ramp. Someone lured them here under false pretenses, but who? The car was locked, but when they looked inside, they saw that the front passenger seat was pushed forward. This indicated that someone had come out of the back seat, one of the girls. They thought all 3 women had gotten on this boat together. More clues came to light when they were able to get inside Joe's car. They had it towed to the crime lab, where it was thoroughly examined. As you would expect, it had the remnants of a long car ride, lots of brochures, maps, handwritten directions, and an UNO card game. There was even a puzzle in the back seat, but something stood out to them because of what was written on it. Days in stationery from the last hotel they had checked into. Out of everything else in the car, this looked like the most recent set of directions. It was sitting on the front passenger seat. It said, "Turn right, west on 60, 2.5 miles on the right side, alt before bridge." Then, next to that writing, it said, "Blue with white." Here is the stationery. It's on the front seat. It's as though someone placed it there as they got out of the car. It's directions to this exact location from their hotel. The investigators believed blue and white was the color of the boat that they were looking for. Wow, they were able to determine that this handwriting belonged to Jo. Someone had given her these directions and she wrote them down. But again, who? Now the police go public with this information, including the description of the car and the boat, asking the public to come forward with any information. This case was huge at the time, as you can probably imagine. The entire state and beyond was interested in this case. It was unbelievable. 3 family members murdered while they were on a Disney vacation in the city where magic happens. Well, as soon as they went public with this new information, they kind of regretted it because they had 500 calls come in, and not one of them led to anything productive. They had someone call in and say they thought they saw the car parked there at 2 p.m. A woman said, "I recall my husband commenting on the Ohio plates. However, when they examined those pictures that I told you about, the ones they believed were the last ones ever taken, the investigators believed it was much later when those women arrived at the boat ramp. This one is of Michelle. It kind of looks like she was caught off guard. Her hair is wet, either from a recent shower or possibly swimming. But we know that they don't go into water above their heads, so investigators assumed it was a shower. She was also getting dressed in the picture. Recall she was found wearing a black shirt with a blue bikini top underneath. She's wearing that blue bikini top in this photo, and the black shirt she hadn't put on yet. Those white shorts and those white shoes were never found. Most likely, they were thrown into the water or taken by her killer to be disposed of later on. Timengo Mota. The other photo is from the hotel balcony. You can see the parking lots, and beyond that, to the left, the bay with the palm trees, power lines, and the sunset. This told investigators the women were still in that hotel room when the sun was starting to set. So they looked up when darkness would have fallen, and believed that these pictures were taken sometime between 7:30 and 8 o'clock p.m. Sunset cruises were very popular. It's something this area is known for. One of the prettiest types of pictures you can take while vacationing on the bay is to get in a boat at sunset and capture the perfect picture of the sun kissing the water. It's just so sad because the investigators found an opened package of film and believed that it had just been inserted into the camera right before the women left to get on that boat. These last couple of pictures that were taken were essentially just to use up the last roll of film so they could put a new one into the camera to capture the most beautiful sunset. This timeline was confirmed by a man who was staying at the hotel. He came forward and said, "I was eating dinner. I was at the hotel restaurant and 3 women came in around 7 p.m. He remembers because they were all laughing and having a good time. He said the older daughter actually looked at him, stopped, looked over, smiled, and said, 'Hi.' He matched the description of these women to what he saw in the news. Just as the investigators were following this lead, looking for every single white and blue boat registered in that area, which was basically every single boat in existence because this was a very common color combination, they got information that pulled them in an entirely different direction. Something seemed too perfect to be a mere coincidence. They got word regarding John Rogers and what he did to his niece Michelle. An Ohio sheriff relayed all of the information about John's case to the Florida team, including the fact that records showed he had been in Manatee County, just a few miles south of where the boaters found the bodies of Jo, Christy, and Michelle. Over the years, John and Hal's parents took winter vacations in a trailer park in Florida, and only months before these murders, John had stayed there for several weeks before going to prison. The detectives wondered if John had recruited a hitman to kill his brother's family. Why? Well, they thought it was so that Michelle could never testify against him in the future. He had been in prison serving time for the previous incident when the murders actually occurred. However, the Florida investigators were flying to Ohio to go through all of John Rogers' letters that he wrote in prison, his calls, everything. But the more they looked into the likelihood that John orchestrated these murders, it seemed highly unlikely. According to the inmates that were living with John, he didn't have any friends coming there. There was no way he was going to plan a murder. He didn't have any friends on the inside or the outside, and having no one on the outside to carry it out made a triple homicide even more unlikely. He couldn't have done it without someone to assist him. It turned out that John Rogers had only received one recent visitor, and it was his mom. She came to see him in April. This was before Joe and the girls had even planned their trip, and after the murders, John did make a phone call. It was to his parents on Father's Day, but that seemed completely normal, and he hadn't received any suspicious letters. Phone records show he never even made any long-distance phone calls since the murders occurred. But this is when someone else gets on their radar. Hal Rogers. Remember, he was the one who bailed his brother out of jail when he was initially arrested. Wasn't it Hal who told his family to go and take a vacation and then stayed behind? He knew there was no one to watch over the farm. His brother had already been in prison. So wasn't it a little odd that all of a sudden he used that as an excuse not to go? Plus, the locals didn't think he was grieving. He was still working on the farm just as usual. It's true that people grieve in different ways, but it seemed way too connected not to look into it. It was time to pay a visit to Hal. When they interviewed him, he insisted he was not involved. He explained he bailed his brother out before he knew anything about what John had done to his daughter. But still, the fact that he was under suspicion for attacking another young woman, and yet Hal still bailed him out. Well, it was his brother. He explained he decided to fulfill his promise to his brother and post the bond only after John agreed to sell half of his portion of the farm to him and never return. Then investigators found out that Hal withdrew $7,000 in cash from his bank account just 2 days after his family hadn't come home. It looked as though he might have been possibly paying someone for carrying out these murders, didn't it? That's what the investigators thought. Hal was their first official suspect, but Hal had a reason for everything he said. He said, "Look, I knew I was going to have to retrace their path. I was going to have to pay to have a plane fly over. I was going to need cash to travel and to figure everything out." He said he didn't have credit cards because he didn't believe in them, and he told the investigators all he was doing was trying to conduct his own investigation. He said the money had never been used. It was still in an envelope in his truck, and they found it on the dashboard. But still, investigators had to ask around. Jeff, Michelle's boyfriend, had just been told about the tragedy. He had been calling again and again asking, "How are they home yet?" Right after Hal received the news from Sheriff Owens, Jeff called to ask if Michelle was back. Jeff said that Hal sounded really odd, almost furious. He kind of yelled at Jeff, asking, "Who is this?" Jeff was confused, saying, "It's Jeff? Is Michelle home?" Hal just lost it. He broke down and said, "They're not coming home." Jeff was confused, asking, "What do you mean? What do you mean they're not coming home? Had they skipped town?" But Hal finally told him exactly what happened, and Jeff was completely distraught. He took out all of his pain by punching a hole in the door of his basement. He also got right in his truck and drove over to the farm. That's when he said he saw Hal just tending to the animals as usual, which he thought was odd considering the news this man just got. However, investigators realized that this was just the way it was for Hal. He was just trying not to think about what happened to his family. It didn't make him guilty of causing it. While the Tampa detectives were in Van Wert County, funeral services were being held for Joe, Christy, and Michelle. Their bodies were finally transported from Florida back to Ohio, and they were buried at their local church, the Zion Lutheran Church. This pastor, who usually got someone from the community to help dig graves, said, "I can't. You need to go find someone else. This is just way too close to home." He had known Hal Rogers and his wife and his daughters for decades. He was one of Hal's closest friends. He watched Michelle and Christy grow up, and he just knew he wasn't going to be able to do it. He couldn't dig the graves that they would go into forever. Joe, Christy, and Michelle's loved ones were initially really worried about how to dress the women for their final funeral service. It hadn't really occurred to them that they were so decomposed that they weren't going to have an open casket. They realized they were going to be closed, and that's when the top of clothing was just the last thing on their minds. That is so tough. I know we hear about these types of cases all the time. We have an understanding of what these bodies might have looked like. But these people from this small town had never experienced anything like this. They had no idea. And it's not something that a loved one should ever have to see. Because Hal couldn't see the bodies due to the state of decomposition they were in, he had no idea if it was his family inside these coffins. He was left solely to rely on the coroner's report for confirmation. Since Hal hadn't seen or touched the bodies of his wife and daughters, he wasn't able to say goodbye. Having the ability to see them in their last moments and say goodbye provides closure and acceptance. But grieving is much more difficult when you can't do that. Hal knew that once he put up grave markers where Michelle, Joe, and Christy were buried, it would truly mean that his family had died. So he refused to do this for a very long time. Although he knew that Joe and his girls were not coming back, he couldn't help but cling to the hope that they would return. Every time he heard the phone ring or someone walking through the door, he thought it was going to be them. He thought he was going to hear their voices again. Whenever he looked towards the house, he thought about his family being back together again. He felt like his wife and daughters were going to roll up into that driveway from Florida at any moment, and he regretted his choice not to go on that vacation. I can only imagine how that would have affected him. I think there would have been so much guilt, so much regret. An overwhelming number of people attended the funeral service to pay their respects, around 300 people. As a result, the small congregation had to cram into the basement and the fellowship hall of the church. Hal remembers seeing at least 12 news vans parked all along these country roads. On his way to his family's funeral service, he realized that each of these news stations was there to try to be first with the most interesting story and the best pictures they could get about what happened to his wife and daughters. It was their murder, and it was surreal. Hal didn't have to think about what to wear because he only owned one single suit that Joe had bought for him many years ago. It was a gray pinstripe suit, and he paired it with a fuchsia shirt. Joe always said that it made him look really handsome. And there they were, right in the front of the church, the 3 caskets. Next to them were pictures of Joe, Michelle, and Christy, just smiling brightly. Inside each casket, Hal requested a teddy bear be placed. There was not one person with a dry eye in that entire congregation. Hal wore sunglasses as he usually did. It was just one of his signature looks. I've seen him wear these tinted dark lenses in other pictures. This time they helped to hide his tears. He even saw his mother at the funeral. At first, it really shocked him. He was still mad at her for accusing Michelle of lying, but he knew this was not the right moment to be upset and give any of that attention. After the ceremony, everyone went to a small cemetery across the street from the church to bury Joe, Michelle, and Christy. There's a picture of one of Christy's friends sobbing as they lowered her casket. At some point, Hal just turned to his family and said that he wanted to be left alone. Not too long after this, he was seen tending to the farm again. It probably helped him get his mind off of everything. This place was all he had left. His family had helped him create this beautiful farm, and he didn't want to let that die with them. By now, investigators realized they had to put a pause on any more accusations pointed Hal's way for the time being. It was back to Florida, where something of significance was found inside the Oldsmobile. As the crime scene technicians were combing through all the papers and brochures, they stumbled upon the only other one with handwriting on it. It was a brochure for Clearwater Beach, and on the back were the words "Days In, Courtney Causeway, Route 60. At the bottom were directions that said Courtney Campbell Causeway at 60 days in. Also at the top left were the words Boy Scout and Columbus, which are actually roads that lead toward the hotel. It was Joe's handwriting that wrote Boy Scout and Columbus, but the directions weren't in Joe's handwriting like the last set of directions. This was written by someone else. When compared to handwriting samples of Michelle and Christy, it wasn't their handwriting either. What it proved was that these women encountered someone who knew they were staying at the Days Inn. Maybe they had gotten lost and asked someone for directions to their hotel. They were probably near Boy Scout and Columbus and were given directions toward where their hotel would be. So did this person who helped them have any clue that could help police, or worse, was this the person who killed them? It had been hours after the directions were written that these women met their fate on a boat in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico. So was this a connection? Investigators were not sure. They weren't sure of many things. They didn't even know if this was one person or two people. It seemed more plausible at this point that it would have taken more than one person to subdue three women, especially if each one of them had to be bound and forced to have intercourse, and then thrown over one by one. But on the other hand, the perpetrator could have threatened the women at gunpoint or with a weapon. Even that might have been enough to merely threaten to push them overboard because none of them could swim well, if at all. It's a terrible thought to envision each woman being bound, having to watch the others being taken advantage of, and then being left to drown with nothing they could do. It is just so evil. What kind of monster would do something like this? That's what the investigators really want to find out. They're focused on that handwriting because it was all they had. It sounds crazy, but they took samples from every employee who was working at businesses in their mapped-out radius, from where they thought the women were when they received the directions. Here's Boy Scout in Columbus with this major highway nearby called Dale Mabry. Investigators are focused on all of these establishments in this area between the highway and the hotel. It was a huge operation and still nothing. Months went by. There were rewards offered, and the media was given tons of information about the case to put out there to the public. Everyone in the area knew about it, and still, there were no leads. They thought this case was never going to be solved. But an even bigger lead was to come. In October of 1989, 4 months after the murders, Detective Capel saw a bulletin that caught his eye. There had been an unsolved case where a woman from Canada claimed that she had encountered a man in St. Petersburg while she was on vacation. This man had also asked her if she wanted to go on a boat ride at Madeira Beach. But the unthinkable happened. Instead of getting pictures of a sunset, she was attacked and forced to engage in intercourse. However, this woman survived, and they wanted details. It wasn't every day that you hear about a case like this where a woman was on a boat and such things occurred. This fact piqued the detectives' interest. It was also within a very tight time frame. This happened on May 15th, just 2 weeks before the Rogers women were found dead. This is Madeira Beach. It's on the St. Petersburg side, but still close to the Skyway Bridge and the vicinity where the women were found. Not only that, but the woman had described the boat as being a light blue color with a white interior. That was enough for detectives to fly to Canada and speak with this woman. She went by the name Jane. She was 24 years old and had just graduated from college. She and her friend decided it was time to celebrate and have some fun for their accomplishments, so they decided to go to Florida, Madeira Beach to be exact. It seemed perfect. It was a small beach town, well known for its sea-themed John's Pass Village and a 1,000-foot boardwalk along the intracoastal. It was lined with tons of cute beach-style restaurants and lots of bars, and it was considered a safe area. Jane and her friend were excited for their adventure. On the evening of May 14th, the two Canadian tourists were walking into a 7-Eleven convenience store to grab a few things before heading out to the bars to have some fun on the boardwalk. That's when they bumped into a guy. He was sitting in a dark-colored SUV and started chatting with them. He introduced himself as Dave Posner. He struck up a friendly conversation with the girls. He was kind of tall, tan, muscular, and had long blondish hair. He looked like the surfer type, very Florida, and he seemed to be in his 30s. He was just very friendly. They talked about where they were going that night, and that's when the guy offered them some tips. Because he was a local, he warned them that the area they were going to could be a little crazy, and that they should be careful. He made a comment about them being two pretty girls, and said he didn't want to see anything bad happen to them because it was kind of a high crime area. This was news to them. They thought they were going to be fine. So he offered to at least give them a ride there so they didn't have to walk, since he didn't think that was going to be safe. The girls took him up on his offer. It was way better to get a ride, and he seemed nice enough. It was about a 4-minute drive, but the walk would have taken them maybe 30 minutes. While they were on the way, they were still talking, and he mentioned he owned a boat. Jane's friend got excited and wanted to go on a boat ride. He said, "You know what? It would be really fun and a great experience for you while you're here." So he offered to take them out the next day. There were a lot of places where you could pay for a boat ride, but free is much better. So it sounded great to the girls. He told them where the dock was. It was called Don's Dock, right in the area. The girls agreed to meet him in the morning. However, as the night went on, the girls were pretty tired. They had partied into the early morning hours, and Jane's friend was not feeling it anymore, even though it was kind of her idea to begin with. But Jane wasn't the type of person to sell someone out. She thought it would be rude if they didn't show up, even if it was just to let the guy know, "You know what? We can't make it. Let's reschedule for another time later in the week." That sort of thing. So, Jane heads out early in the morning to meet up with Dave. When she gets there, he's already ready with the boat. He says, "Where's your friend?" Jane explains that her friend just didn't want to go, and Dave says, "You know what? That's fine. No worries. Let's have some fun." And they actually did. They spent the entire afternoon going up and down the intercoastal waterway. This is the area right here, in between all these little islands, so to speak. It's very calm, with lots to see, big houses, waterfront restaurants. It's very nice. Dave acted like a tour guide, showing her all around. They had a great time. He even brought fishing poles and showed her how to fish, and they did that for a little while. He wasn't acting strange at all. He was normal and very cordial. They were together for a few hours. This wasn't just a short date, it was an all-day affair, and they had a lot of fun. So much so she agreed to come back for a sunset cruise. Dave told her to grab her camera and try to convince her friend to come out because she wouldn't want to miss this opportunity. It was an amazing chance to get pictures of the sunset over the water. Of course, Jane was in. She agreed and was excited. She told her friend how fun it was and what a relaxing day she had on the water. But for some reason, her friend had no interest in going with her on a night cruise. Maybe she had some kind of intuition, but Jane was not going to stand up Dave, especially after all he did for her that afternoon. So she goes back to the dock before sunset to meet him again, camera in hand. This time, when Jane explained that her friend declined, Dave did seem kind of disappointed. But it was more about how her friend was really going to miss out on some very remarkable moments on their Florida vacation. The thing is, Jane was not familiar with the waters. She wasn't aware that Dave wasn't taking her on the same route they did before. This time, they were headed out to sea, out into the vast waters of the Gulf of Mexico. Does it sound familiar? It's a much different area. No people, no restaurants, no one can hear you scream. This is the same goal that investigators believe the Rogers were taken before they were thrown overboard to drown. All of a sudden, it seemed like Dave's personality kind of switched. The further they got from the shore, he seemed to be more agitated. He did explain that they were going to go to a more open water area because the pictures were better. Nothing would obscure your view. Jane was fine with that, but she did tell Dave she needed to be back at the dock before it got dark. So they anchored. Dave took out the fishing poles again, telling her, "You know what? This is a great time to fish when the sun goes down because the fish come out to eat." Jane was snapping pictures the whole time. Dave took the camera and got some really nice shots of Jane on the boat, with her fishing, the sunset, and Jane took pictures of the sunset too and of Dave. Then, all of a sudden, there was some urgency to stop fishing, which was fine with Jane. She didn't mind because it started to get dark, but instead of turning back, Dave moved in on Jane and made a move on her. Jane kind of figured this would happen. Like, why would this guy, this random guy, take you on this random tourist ride without expecting something in return? It shouldn't be like that, but she kind of just had this feeling, and it was happening. At first, it started with a hug, but Jane just wanted to make him aware she wasn't interested in going any further, especially because her friend was expecting her back soon. Well, that did not go over well with Dave. He became visibly upset. He started to speak to her in a really rude tone of voice, and then grabbed a hold of her and began to force her down. Jane realized that Dave was going to have sex with her no matter what. Still, she tried to push away. She told him no and warned him, "If you do anything to me, I'll remember your face and I'll go straight to the authorities right away." Jane was struggling and screaming. At this point, Dave said, "What are you going to do? You're wasting your time. No one is going to hear you. And then what are you going to do? Jump?" He told her, "Good luck with that. These waters are infested with sharks." But Jane thought about it. She could see the lights of the shore, and though they were far away, it was better in her mind at that moment than to let this man have his way with her. He told her to stop screaming or else he was going to take some duct tape and put it over her mouth, and that really scared her. She couldn't imagine not being able to breathe out of her mouth. Then Dave said something. He asked her, "Is sex really something you want to lose your life over?" Wow. He really said that. It's unbelievable. Sometimes I want to ask these same men, is sex something worth killing someone over and then going to prison for the rest of your life or getting the death penalty? All of this scared her into submission. She knew no one was going to hear her scream, and she realized that if she didn't let him do what he wanted, he was probably going to kill her. I felt so bad for her because in the interview, this is when she really starts to cry. It was this part of the story because she blamed herself. She said it was her fault that she made so many mistakes, that she was always taught not to talk to strangers, and especially not to go somewhere with one. And now look at her. She thought, here I am in this compromising situation, and then she thought to herself, I should have known better. So many thoughts were going through her head, but she let Dave have his way with her. She knew there was no other way. Afterward, this man gives her some water and tells her to wash herself off. Then he grabs her camera, removes the film, and throws it into the water. He turns on the boat engine and just goes right back to the shore. At this point, Dave's demeanor changes again. He seems scared. He even starts to get sick and leans over the boat and throws up. Then he apologizes, saying, I've taken something from you that you can never get back. Jane didn't know what to think of all this. A man who had just done something terrible to her was now talking to her like a friend. And it didn't stop there. He told her he knew she was going to report him, but he begged her to wait a little while. He said, my mom's sick. I don't want the police to show up at her door and give her a heart attack because it would probably kill her. Jane thought that he was being genuine until she realized he was most likely scared because he probably planned to kill her, but realized her friend could identify him. Now he had to let her go. So that's why he was probably throwing up. He was scared. Soon enough, they were close to the dock, but Dave didn't drop her off there. He took her to a darker, more secluded spot where she actually had to wade through the water and climb up an embankment with no clothes on from the waist down. She finally got back to shore, and this poor woman, God, I feel so bad for her. She's so lucky to be alive. She was able to finally get back to her room, and she kept her word. She went straight to the police and reported what had happened. The police tried to find this Dave Posner person, but he didn't exist. He had given her a fake name, of course. There was nothing for them to go on, and Jane was set to return to Canada. She really thought that he would never pay for what he did to her. At this point, though, the Florida investigators truly believe that Jane's case is connected to the Rogers murders. Both involved women who were from out of town, were targeted, and didn't know the area well. The man offered to help them in one way or another, kind of befriending them, then offered to take them out on a boat ride, a sunset cruise at that. The duct tape, the threats, the blue and white boat, the fact that they happened 2 weeks apart, and they involved forced intercourse, leaving the women with no clothes on from the waist down. These similarities are too many to ignore. Even though Jane got away, he did threaten to kill her, especially if she tried to resist. There were way too many similarities for this not to have been the same guy. Remember the tip that initially came in from the lady who said, "I saw the car at the boat ramp at 2 p.m." Well, this was kind of brushed aside, not really taken into account, because once the investigators developed the photos, they saw that this was probably around 7:30 or 8 that the women met this man at the boat ramp. Think about this. What if another connection between Jane and the Rogers women was that they did go on an afternoon boat ride first, just like Jane, and everything was fine, just like it was with Jane? Recall the picture of Michelle later that evening. She had a sunburn. Of course, she's been in Florida for many days, it's hot and sunny. But what if this is this guy's MO? To make it seem like he's Mr. Nice Guy, take you out on this normal boat ride, then invite you back for a night cruise, just like he did with Jane. The Rogers could have done the same thing and gone back at 8 p.m., believing, just like Jane did, that nothing was going to go wrong and that this man was going to be a tour guide, not a killer. Typically, these kinds of boat rides are quite pricey, and we know that Joe used a discount card for the hotel. They didn't have a lot of money to spend for the three of them to go on a boat ride. So they could have thought that this was a pretty good deal, this nice man going to take them out on a cruise for the sunset. It just makes more sense to me, especially if this was the guy. I really saw that as a connection, and it was just a possibility that was not discussed again. But back to the story. Jane also kept another promise, that she wouldn't forget what that man's face looked like. She helped the sketch artist create a composite of the suspect, and this is what it looked like. The man was said to be about 5 feet 10 inches, with a medium husky build, 33 to about 40 years old, with light hair and a mustache. Jane was even able to remember what the boat looked like in detail. It was an older boat with a blue faded hull and a dark-colored canopy that was down. It had a single white engine that lifted up, a completely open interior with 2 places to sit on the stern and back, and a spongy black material covering the steering wheel. There was a storage area up front where you could actually step down into it. The boat had a windshield and 2 seats up front. Jane remembered a lot. Investigators were anxious to get this information out to the media. Before the investigators left Canada, Jane provided them with one final detail about the assailant. She said that the man told her he owned an aluminum business and that his house was about 2 hours away by boat. The investigators had a lot of hope. They were certain that someone from the area would recognize this man, or his boat, or both. The very next day, the story was on every news station. They ran the story everywhere. At the time, this was the most important case. Everyone at both of these departments was working on it. Hundreds of hours went into it, with the hope that this composite and the boat sketch would lead to a tip that would solve the case. But it didn't. Hundreds of tips came in, but none of them panned out. There was one that seemed really promising. At one point, a guy with an unlicensed boat was giving boat rides to tourists at the dock where they found Joe's car. The detectives tracked this man down and discovered some compelling information about him, including his arrest for several crimes: burglary, grand theft, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. This man lived only about 5 miles from that boat dock, so they questioned him at his house. When they arrived, they found a blue and white boat parked there. Their inspection of the area revealed concrete blocks very similar to those tied to the victim's ropes. A spot on one of the concrete blocks appeared to be a dark stain, which they thought could be blood. When they peeked inside the boat, they saw rope, the same type used in the murders. It seemed like this guy was a real potential suspect. They knocked on his door and questioned him with his wife. They asked him what he was doing on the days of the murders. The man told them he was fishing with his friends in his boat. The detectives realized that he had just placed himself on the bay when the Rogers women were thrown in. But then he pulled one of the detectives aside. He didn't want his wife to hear what he was saying and said, "Listen, I wasn't fishing on the night of the murder. I was with my girlfriend." He gave them her information, and this was his alibi. It was confirmed. He agreed to take a polygraph, and he passed it. They cleared him. But I hope that these investigators let that poor woman know that her husband was guilty of at least one thing: being a cheater. Once again, they were at a dead end. They felt helpless, but were determined to bring justice to the Rogers family. To inspire themselves to keep going, they displayed photos of Joe, Michelle, and Christy on their whiteboards to remind them why they had to keep fighting for the truth. Look at all these case files on the shelf, so many, each with every tip that they had collected, yet they just sat there for months. Soon, they were collecting dust, and the task force was dismantled. Officers had to work on new cases, and the Rogers case went cold. Poor Hal never got closure. Even though the investigators had moved on from accusing him, that didn't stop people in his town from whispering. Many thought he was guilty. They couldn't fathom that the Rogers women were just randomly chosen out of thousands of people who take trips to Florida. It was hard for me not to feel bad for Hal, especially when I heard that the hotel still charged Joe's credit card for the entire stay. Even though she and her daughters had merely hung out in the room for a few hours before they were brutally murdered, the room was still checked in under her name and not checked out of until a week later when the police arrived. So, it was still Joe's responsibility to pay, as far as the hotel was concerned. Hal was stuck with the bill, which came out to $321.46. He didn't dispute it either, he just paid the bill. That was closure, though. He even tried to get some by actually taking the same trip on the same route his wife and daughters took. He drove from Ohio to Florida and stopped to see the place where their bodies had been found. He left a few days before Christmas and actually placed wreaths in different locations, especially where the Coast Guard had responded. Hal was depressed for a long time before the murders, and Joe was the only one who could be there for him, to be his rock, to pick him up when he was down. But now, she was gone. He was more depressed than he'd ever been. He even thought about ending his life so that he could rest in peace with his family. But somehow, he found the courage to press on because he wanted to see the killer brought to justice. The year anniversary was approaching, but time stood still inside the police station where all the Rogers files lay unopened. But that was about to change. Sergeant Glenn Moore was transferred to the homicide department as the new supervisor. He had worked on the Rogers case when it first broke, but only briefly. However, this was the one case that stuck with him, especially because he had two daughters who were the same age as Michelle and Christy. He was determined to breathe new life into this case, so he asked all the investigators who had worked on the case previously to brief him on what they had already found. They seemed to think they had done everything they could and that there was nothing else to look at. While Sergeant Moore wasn't so sure, he wasn't going to give up that easily. He asked his commander for a chance on this case. He said, "Please just let me review it. If there's truly nothing we can look into, fine, but we gotta try." The commander agreed, giving him 2 weeks to work on it. They had already spent a lot of resources on this case, so Moore formed a task force of 6 investigators and picked the best of the best. They scoured the files, went through each and every interview, every tip, the autopsy reports, the pictures, everything. They jotted down any thoughts or questions that came to mind. They had a method where they sat around a table wearing gloves, passing each piece of evidence around and looking at it one by one in the presence of everyone else. They would talk through anything they noticed. After the 2 weeks were up, Moore and his team had come up with 150 unanswered questions. These were things they thought had never been investigated. That was more than enough to reopen the case. The most important piece of evidence, according to Moore, was that Clearwater brochure. Remember the one with the directions to the Days Inn? Well, get this, it had never been examined for fingerprints. If someone else had written on it, Moore thought for sure it could be processed for prints. Not only that, it was already noted that the brochure had directions to the Days Inn at the crossroads of Boy Scout and Columbia written by Joe. On the map, there was actually a circle drawn around the Days Inn, but a second area was labeled with an X. Sergeant Moore believed that the Rogers family had encountered their killer at the spot where the X was marked. However, he had to discover where this was and why the women were there. As you can see, this is a very ambiguous area because the map isn't detailed. The X could be anywhere. It wasn't to scale, and there were no landmarks on the map. Really, there were only a few different areas. So how could they figure out where this location was? Moore was kind of desperate. He decided to ask someone outside of the investigation. He wanted someone to think like a tourist, so he asked his wife of 20 years, Carol. She was a mom, and he said she could probably think like Joe. They drove together the same route Joe would have driven to get to the Days Inn. Carol realized something. She said that if you weren't familiar with the area, it would have been very confusing. One of the roads looked like an exit, but wasn't. She believed what happened was that Joe thought she was getting off at an exit, but instead took a wrong turn. So, instead of going the right way, Moore and his wife took the wrong turn on purpose and ended up near a McDonald's. Carol believed Joe probably pulled over to try to get her bearings straight, to look at the maps and say, okay, where are we? Let's look at some landmarks. We're gonna be fine. We'll get there. That is when they believed she encountered the killer. Just like Jane said, he was friendly and seemed to want to help. He probably acted the same way with Joe, making that X on the map. It really did match where the McDonald's was. After thinking about all this, Moore believed the killer went one step further to pretend that he was genuinely concerned. He thinks that he called the Days Inn and asked if the women had made it there safely. When he gets transferred to the room and speaks to them, this is when Moore believes he offered to give them a ride on his boat. Remember, the directions were written by Joe on the Days Inn stationery. It makes sense that if she was on the phone, she would grab the stationery and mark down the directions. The stationery came from the hotel room, unlike the brochure that was already in the car. This made sense to me too, so orchestrated and creepy. So now, instead of focusing on the map, the detectives decided to focus on the handwriting itself. It was very distinctive, but of course they didn't have anything to compare it to. They weren't sure how they could use it to find any connections. But it turned out there was a palm print lifted from the brochure, so if they could find someone whose handwriting matched, they could use the print to connect them to having been with the Rogers before they died. However, this wouldn't prove that they were the killer, but they had enough information to believe it probably was. What they really wanted at this point was a profile of what a person who carried out a crime like this might be like. The FBI stepped up and agreed to allow their Behavioral Analysis Unit, BAU, to create a profile of the killer. Here's what they compiled. They believed he was a serial killer and that it wasn't his first time doing this. He would likely do it again until he was caught, but next time he would be more careful. He would make sure to do a better job to avoid getting caught, leave behind less evidence, and ensure the bodies were hidden. Because it had been almost 2 years since the murders, and he hadn't been caught, the BAU believed he was confident in his abilities to keep killing and going undetected. However, he wouldn't look like a killer in their perspective. He would be the guy next door. He'd blend in. They thought he was a white male, 30 to 40 years old, above average intelligence, neat and meticulous, very personable, well off enough to afford a boat and respected throughout his community. Yikes. This sounded like it could be anyone. He wouldn't look like a monster, but he sure as hell was one. As a matter of fact, they believed he was deranged. According to the BAU agents, the killer covered the women's mouths but left their eyes uncovered, so they would have to watch what was happening to their loved ones. He wanted to feel their fear and actually got off on watching these poor women fear for their lives, especially as he pushed each one of them overboard to their deaths. They knew they were next. They knew their fate. It was just more evil. It's not even human. This person was truly a monster. The BAU believed that this man lived in the Tampa Bay area and was very familiar with his surroundings. He was probably on the prowl right now, looking for more victims. After giving this profile to Sergeant Moore, the FBI gave him a piece of advice. They told him to use the media on this one. This went against what Moore was taught. He was taught to keep the best evidence under seal. But now he was being told to go against everything he'd ever known. Sometimes, if you want different results, you have to take a different course of action. So he did. He held his very first press conference of his entire career and laid everything out on the table. Literally, the biggest piece of evidence they had at this point was the handwriting, so he figured this was his chance to use it. They shared it with the news outlets. Every reporter was present in that room. They got a first-hand look and the opportunity to run with this story, and they did. Every newspaper and news station was posting about the handwriting on this brochure. Sergeant Moore was confident that the handwriting belonged to the killer, so he decided to make a very firm statement on camera. He said that if they found the person who wrote those directions, they found their killer. He did this to send a message to the killer himself that they were onto him and to prompt the community to act. If this handwriting looked familiar, come forward now. You may be wondering how in the world someone could actually recognize handwriting. Something that stood out was the way this person wrote a capital T in the middle of a word. He did it with A's as well. They'd be capitalized. He also had a really weird way of writing the letter Y. It was kind of swirly at the end. Moore really thought this was it. But we know what's happened before, and just like the past, it repeated itself. No viable leads yet. So many tips came rushing in, some of them taking them on wild goose chases and wasting valuable time. By 1992, 2 years had passed, and a new chief had joined the St. Petersburg Police Department. By February, he told Moore that they had 6 months to solve this case, and after that, they had to switch gears and focus on other cases. The task force would have to be dismantled again. These investigators were working around the clock, non-stop. They were desperate. One detective even suggested they should post the handwriting on a billboard right in the area where the women were murdered. It was a touristy area with lots of traffic. This had never been done before. They already had billboards up with Michelle, Joe, and Christie's photos, but crime scene evidence on a billboard? That was insane to them. It was unprofessional and expensive. But they got the billboard company to donate the space for free, so that's exactly what they did. Even Moore's own father pitched in for resources. It was really a combined effort. So many people cared deeply about these women who lost their lives in such a horrific way. It became personal to so many people. Their faces became the faces of everyone's children, everyone's wives. They were determined to find the killer, and so was someone else. Someone who had been working on this case the entire time, but without a badge or experience solving crimes. This person thought the task force wasn't working fast enough and was furious about the way the case was being handled. It was a Tampa resident named Joanne Steffi. She called the police department specifically asking if she could speak directly to Sergeant Moore. Usually, calls like this would not be transferred, but Joanne said she knew who killed Joe, Michelle, and Christy. At this point, the investigators needed all the help they could get. When Sergeant Moore was connected with Joanne, she was yelling at him, saying that they were not taking her seriously and that she was about to hire a private investigator to solve the murders herself. Sergeant Moore had no idea what this woman was talking about. He had never spoken to her before and had no clue who she was. But that was her point. Joanne told the sergeant that 6 weeks ago, when the suspect's writing was first published in the newspaper, she had sent them a fax containing a handwriting sample of her former next-door neighbor. She had suspected he was responsible for the murders long before that and had been working on proving it was him, especially ever since that composite sketch was released. She thought she knew exactly who it was. He was living right next door to her at the time. Throughout 1989, Joanne closely followed the case. She related to the Rogers family and even shared a name, sort of. Joanne and Joe. Sergeant Moore listened, continuing to be shocked by what Joanne was telling him. starting with the fact that this neighbor of hers was an aluminum contractor. He worked on pool enclosures and things like that. He drove a dark-colored Jeep Cherokee and lived minutes from the dock where the Rogers vehicle had been found. To top it off, the guy owned a blue and white boat, until a few months after the murders, when he sold it. Joanne also explained that everyone liked this guy. They thought he was so nice and friendly, such an upstanding citizen. But not Joanne. Not at all. She could see right through his facade. The very first time she met him, before the murders, he made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. She had never experienced that in her entire life. But once she saw that composite sketch and looked at him while driving by his house one afternoon, she just thought to herself, "Damn, that's him." So why did she wait so long to call the police? Because she asked a friend what they thought, and they weren't so sure. They didn't know if the composite sketch looked like him. Her friend warned her not to go around making accusations about people because it could ruin an innocent man's life. This guy was married and had a little girl, so Joanne hesitated. She was also worried that if she was right about his identity, he would come after her if he found out she was the one who reported him, and he'd kill her for it. That's a really hard place to be in. However, she did report it anonymously. She had a deputy take her statement, but kept her name out of it. Joanne wondered why no one had ever followed up with her. She thought that maybe they had actually interviewed her neighbor and cleared him, but she'd never know, especially since he and his family moved away without even telling anyone. That was back in 1990. Joanne's sister even called in a tip after they watched an episode of Unsolved Mysteries featuring the Rogers case. She told them all about Joanne's suspicion and was promised that a detective would reach out. He said he did, but that he got no answer. It was the press conference that brought the case to Joanne's mind again when Moore said that finding the person who wrote those directions would find the killer. Joanne was determined to either prove her neighbor was him or to exclude him. She remembered something. A neighbor friend of hers, Moselle Smith, had hired this man to do some work on her home. So she begged her to please dig through her old paperwork to see if there was anything he had written on. She did. She found the contract and the check that he signed. Joanne took both of those documents and faxed them over to the sheriff's office. She waited, but it just got lost in the sea of other tips and hundreds of other documents from people claiming the same thing. But when that billboard went up, after she had already sent everything over to them, she became furious. She just kept wondering why they hadn't looked at what she faxed. It was Joanne's persistence that really paid off because finally they were taking a look. However, visually, they weren't sure it was a match. The contract was on a carbon copy, not the original one. It was very faded. But to me, it looks exactly like the handwriting on the brochure. I can see those tears clearly, but they just couldn't be sure. However, once they got a picture of the man Joanne was talking about, they were stunned by his resemblance. His name was Oba Chandler, not Dave Posner. When they were provided with his old address, they noticed it was on Dalton Avenue, right near that McDonald's, where they thought Joe might have stopped, and only 2 miles from the boat ramp. They did a background check on Oba Chandler and were shocked by what they found. He had an extensive criminal record, even as a juvenile. Oba Chandler had 18 offenses listed from Florida and Ohio, including armed robbery, evading prison, counterfeiting, and a charge for disorderly conduct in 1971, where he was caught peeking into an apartment window and touching himself. Running his name through every available database, the task force discovered that in 1992, Oba Chandler was 45 years old, married, had a young daughter, a toddler at the time, and was living near Daytona Beach in Port Orange, Florida, about 2 hours away from Tampa. The detectives felt they had enough information to consider Oba their prime suspect. They set out to interview people from his neighborhood, and it was chilling to hear what Chandler's neighbors thought of him. He was seen as friendly and normal, but the creepy part was that he would offer neighborhood kids a ride on his boat and take them fishing. Despite having met Joe, Michelle, and Christy before their murders, they still needed more evidence to prove Oba Chandler's involvement. That's where Jane came in again. An investigator and an assistant from the district attorney's office flew to Canada with a photo lineup. They wanted Jane's assistance in identifying her attacker from 6 photos of different individuals. When she went through them, she got to the 3rd photo, held it close, and her face flushed. She finished the lineup but went back to photo number 3. Showing it to the investigators, she said, "This is him." It was a picture of Oba Chandler. The sight of his face made her sick, and she asked the investigator not to show it to her again. Although there wasn't enough evidence for an indictment in the Rogers family murders at that point, there was enough evidence to arrest Oba Chandler for what happened to Jane in May 1989. That charge alone carried a possible life sentence. They could use this to get him off the streets and keep him under surveillance while they built their case against him. Oba Chandler was placed under 24-hour surveillance. Planes flew over his house, and detectives in unmarked vehicles kept watch during the day and night. However, the detectives lost track of him on the day he was supposed to be arrested. He drove away from his house, and despite the operation being set up, the detectives lost sight of him. He headed toward Georgia, and there were concerns he might cross the border and be outside their jurisdiction. They saw him stop at a stereo store and planned to arrest him when he returned to his car. But as luck would have it, a violent thunderstorm rolled in, obscuring visibility and grounding the planes. Chandler drove past the detectives unnoticed. A week later, Oba's wife received a call from Georgia. Oba was on his way home. The detectives followed him as he pulled into a gas station and surrounded him. He never resisted. When he asked what he was being charged with, they told him it was for sexual battery. Oba responded with an eerie calmness, as if he was expecting it. He even tried to make a deal with an officer, suggesting he could provide information about a man who turned back odometers on cars, a crime they considered insignificant compared to a triple murder. This seemed odd, as if Oba knew exactly what he was truly being arrested for. During the car ride back to Tampa, Oba complained about his hands being cuffed behind his back and repeatedly asked if they could be cuffed in front. The detective remembered the cinder blocks tied to Joe, Michelle, and Christie's bodies, the ropes around their necks, their hands tied behind their backs, and their ankles bound together. So he told Oba, "Your handcuffs are fine. Deal with it. The suit is a monster. It reminds me of the tourniquet color. I don't know if you remember that when I did it so long ago. That man had created a device so that he didn't have to use his hands because it hurt when he would strangle his victims." That was a totally different case, but back to Oba Chandler, another little crybaby. When something happens to him following his arrest, Sergeant Moore and the detectives from his task force wanted to question him, but he lawyered up right away. They needed an indictment, so the district attorney was worried that there wouldn't be enough proof that Oba did more than meet these women and kindly give them some directions to their hotel, regardless of his past criminal record. Here's what they laid out as the state's potential case. It's believed that Joe Rogers had pulled off the highway at the wrong exit while she was driving along I-275 between Orlando and Tampa. While Joe and her daughters tried to figure out their location on the map, they met up with Oba Chandler. Somehow, some way, they came in contact with him, and he was a smooth talker. He probably saw that the license plate was from Ohio. This would have helped him appear less threatening, like he was a good old country boy because he's from Ohio. So he probably used that to bond with these women. Later that afternoon, they think that Oba Chandler called their hotel to check up on them and appear to care about their well-being, making sure that they made it there safely. That is when they believe he offered to take Joe, Michelle, and Christie out on a sunset cruise. He would tell them what he told Jane, that there wasn't anything like the sunset over Tampa Bay. He probably lured them with the promise of beautiful photos. Those on the force believed that Oba was coming off a high that he had gotten from committing the acts on Jane just 2 weeks earlier. He was confident that he could take on 3 victims. It could also have been a fantasy for him to have more than one woman at once so that they would have to watch each other in fear. Considering that he kept asking Jane, "Why isn't your friend coming?" This time, he was prepared with his duct tape, his ropes, and cinder blocks. When Oba dropped the Rogers women on that boat in the middle of the bay, he probably used a weapon to gain control over them and then forced them to tie one another up. Or maybe he did it himself. Either way, afterward, Oba forced the 3 women to watch as each one of their loved ones was violated. And then who knows what else he did to them. They just sat there in fear. They were helplessly bound. They couldn't do anything. No one knows what Oba said to these women. Maybe he even said he was going to let them go. Or maybe he just tortured them the whole time, telling them what he was going to do to them. Either way, once he dragged the cinder blocks out, they had to have known their fate, and that must have been terrifying, especially for Jo, who was scared of water. She had a lifelong phobia of water. I can't even begin to imagine. It's believed that Oba tossed each of the girls overboard one by one after he was done with them, Jo being the first, so that he could spend more time with the 2 other girls, the younger ones. That's why Jo's body was so much further than the other 2. But it was this last detail, provided by one of Oba's own family members, that pretty much sealed his fate at this stage anyway, so that they could get this indictment. It was a statement from one of Oba's own daughters, an adult daughter. Her name is Crystal Mays. She's all grown up and married to her husband, Rick Mays. She told the investigators that her father came to visit her unexpectedly, all the way in Ohio in 1989, right around the same time that the composite sketch was made public. When he was staying with her, he confided in her that he was on the run and that police were looking for him in Florida in connection to 2 crimes, one involving a woman on a boat and the other for murdering some women, plural. He did not go into detail, but what he said shocked his daughter so much it was something she would never forget. Then her husband also came forward. He told investigators that Oba told him even more about what he had done. According to Rick, Oba confessed he had forced a couple of women to have intercourse with him on his boat and threw at least one of these women overboard. Rick distinctly recalls Oba saying he murdered 3 women in total. After hearing the state's evidence, the grand jury indicted Oba Chandler on 3 counts of first-degree murder in November 1992. In the months that followed, the prosecutors continued to search for more evidence because they knew that the defense would try to poke as many holes as possible. Especially in regard to the statements from Oba's daughter and her husband, he hadn't exactly treated his family very well, and they may have come forward just to get revenge on him, just to spite him. The timing was kind of interesting because why didn't they come forward way back then when it was happening? The investigators and the prosecutor were determined to find as much incriminating information as they could. Between that time and the trial, 5 years after Jo, Michelle, and Christy were killed, Oba Chandler's trial began in September 1994. He just seemed so uninterested in anything that was happening, and he also seemed to have a permanent smirk on his face the entire time. As usual, Oba and his current wife, Deborah Ann Whiteman, were married 1 year before the murders. In 1989, Oba's wife gave birth to their daughter, Whitney. However, unbeknownst to Deborah, this was actually Oba's 8th child, and she was his at least 3rd wife. There could have been more. While his wife was pregnant in 1989, Oba founded Tampa Custom Screens, an aluminum contracting business. He was unlicensed, by the way. Using the profits and his personality to gain more and more clients, he bought a 21-foot blue and white Bayliner boat. But well before Oba became this successful husband and father that he appeared to be in 1992, he had a very different life. He was born in Cincinnati, Ohio on October 11, 1946, to Oba Chandler Sr. and Margaret Johnson. He dropped out of school when he was only in 8th grade, and as a child, when he was 10 years old, his father took his own life by hanging. His mother blamed his father's death on him, and Oba was so enraged about losing his father that he jumped into the open grave during his burial while the dirt was being put on top of it, just to stomp on his father's casket. Wow, if that's not a sign of what the future may hold, I don't know what is. But I guess everyone grieves differently, right? When he was 14, he started stealing cars and was eventually arrested as many as 20 times before he was 18 years old. As an adult, I mentioned his record included counterfeiting, burglary, kidnapping, armed robbery, and peeking into a woman's bedroom while touching himself. But you know what he was really doing? He also broke into a couple's home in Florida. He tied them up, robbed them, and then brought the woman into a bedroom and made her undress and act on point. He would probably have done more, but it seems like he ran out of time. He was apparently with an accomplice, so he could only go that far. But he took out his firearm and rubbed it across this poor woman's stomach. That is so gross. However, though he still managed to get some women to like him, most of Oba's early adulthood was spent getting married and having children. As I said, he has been married at least 3 times and has at least 8 known children with 7 different women. Then he took a little break from being a family man and went into the United States Marine Corps. At the end of his military service, he was honorably discharged. Oba's newest wife, Deborah, did not know that her husband had been imprisoned numerous times for various crimes. When Oba's wife discovered her husband's past, she realized, you know what? He's probably still committing crimes. He would carry around a large amount of cash, and she figured it was probably from drug deals. But she never questioned him about it. She just figured, you know what? That's just the way he was, and she accepted it. They were married on May 14th, 1988. Just 7 months later, they moved into their Dalton Avenue home in Tampa, in the exact same neighborhood as Joanne Steffi. In February of 1989, their daughter Whitney was born. Oba loved his daughter. He was a doting father and very attached to her. However, in the fall of 1989, Deborah began to notice changes in Oba's attitude. He would have a short fuse, be short with her, and yell a lot more. He wouldn't even have sex with her anymore, and they weren't sleeping in the same bedroom for months. This specific home, the one on Dalton Avenue, was on the water, and that is where Oba kept his boat. It had access right to Tampa Bay through a canal in the back. Look, you can see it right here. Very easy for him to come and go whenever he wanted, also making him very familiar with the waterways. They found out he owned this boat at the time of the Rogers murders, but then he sold it just 3 months afterward. As soon as that composite sketch was released, Oba skipped town. He left Deborah and Whitney behind. Deborah had a feeling when she saw that sketch that it was her husband, but she hoped that it wasn't. This was the time that Oba left Florida and went to Ohio to stay with his adult daughter, Crystal. While he was there, he apparently called Deborah and said, "Hey, had the police come looking for me?" She said no. Later, Crystal contacted Deborah when Oba wasn't around and admitted that her father had just confessed that the police were looking for him in relation to a triple murder from May of 1989. Deborah didn't believe it. She said, "Look, there are no murders and no one is looking for Oba." She genuinely thought that Oba was having some kind of mental break and wasn't living in reality. She really did not think he was a murderer. However, when Oba returned to Florida in November of the same year, 1989, Deborah did confront him. Not about the murders, but about the Canadian tourists. He denied having anything to do with it. Deborah tried finally to just get past it all, and somehow she did convince herself that the sketch did not look like her husband at all. But as Joanne Steffi mentioned, the family up and moved in 1990. They relocated to Port Orange. When they moved, they literally just stopped paying their mortgage, and eventually, the bank foreclosed on that property. But get this, the current home that they were in was leased in their daughter Whitney's name, and this was because they wanted to avoid the bank looking for them. They were able to get past their terrible credit that they destroyed from not paying their mortgage and rent a home. Oba was actually working as an informant for the U.S. Customs and Drug Enforcement Agency at the time. Don't ask me how he was able to get this job, but at that point he was actually setting up drug deals and outing members of drug rings. By September of 1992, Oba was back to being a criminal himself. The rent couldn't be paid, and he was desperate, so he robbed someone and then pawned their jewelry along with his wife's gold earrings. So now we're up to date on most of what Oba's life was like before the murders, during and after. But why move? Why evade authorities? Why stop paying your mortgage? Why tell your daughter that you killed people if you didn't? It had to be him, but the state had to prove that it was. Oba remained silent. He insisted he was not their man. The most pressing matter was to prove that Oba was on the water the night of the murders, and that he had the ability to carry out this crime without an alibi. Here are some of the important finds that the state made. They located all of Oba's phone records from the house on Dalton Avenue. They didn't have cell phones back then, but they did have all the records from the house. Oddly, the May and June records, those were the crucial months, were missing. They even tried to subpoena these records, and the company insisted these records had been purged from their system. How? We don't know. However, there was one investigator, Steve Porter, who wasn't going to give up that easily. He found someone who worked at the company in the security department, and this person was able to find a way to retrieve these documents. This was crucial, and you'll know why. Two dates stood out. May 15th, 1989, which was the night of the incident involving Jane, and June 2nd, in the early morning hours, which would have been after midnight, the night the Rogers went on that boat ride. There was a call that came into the Dalton Avenue house at 5:49 p.m. on May 15th, and then on June 2nd, a number of calls came in. One at 1:12 a.m., another at 1:30 a.m., another one at 1:38 a.m., then one at 8:11 a.m., and the final one at 9:52 a.m. The thing is, the number wasn't familiar. It's not one that Porter recognized. It was 813-223-0000. He asked the person working at the company if they knew what this was from. Well, it turns out that this is a number that the company just makes up as a placeholder for any calls that come in from a marine phone. That's a phone that's on a boat. These are collect calls, placed by someone using a phone on board. How it works is that a boat has to radio in and connect to different places, whether it's the Coast Guard, for example, or a marine phone operator. That operator can assist them by connecting them to whatever number they're trying to reach. This meant records of this call would have to exist. These operators kept track of everything, including the caller's name, the time, and the duration of the call. Finding the records took time. Remember, years had gone by, and these were paper records. Someone had to search for them by hand. But luckily, after 6 hours of searching, an employee from the company was able to track them down. Wow. This information on the toll tickets for these calls goes like this. The call on May 15th regarding Jane was from a boat called Gypsy 1, and the person said his name was Oba. And on June 2nd, the calls were again made from Gypsy 1. However, 4 of the calls did not have anyone named, but the last call did. The person said their name was Obi. Close enough. Apparently, when Porter dug into this, he found out that Obi was one of Oba's nicknames. So it's no doubt that he was calling from the waters on both of those nights. He had to have committed these crimes. It puts him there. They needed to know more, and they thought that maybe Oba's wife would be able to answer some of those questions. But she didn't want anything to do with these prosecutors. She was standing by her man, no matter what. She had to be subpoenaed. And of course, she went on record with Oba's defense attorney. There, she basically answered no, I don't know, or I don't recall to every single question, like, did you recall getting a collect call from mobile on those nights? No, can't recall. She couldn't recall her phone number back then. You could not get much out of her. But she also said she didn't know where Oba was on those nights either, so she wasn't exactly providing an alibi. Since they weren't getting much information of value, the prosecutors tried to think like a killer. Why would Oba want to make these calls in the first place? It was kind of weird. Wouldn't it make you look guilty if you pulled up the records? We know it wasn't to tell his wife he killed people, that's for sure. Instead, it was most likely either to give his wife an excuse as to why he was still out at dinner time on May 15th, the time he was about to pick up Jane, and a reason not to worry about where he was and why he didn't come home on the night of June 2nd after he killed the Rogers. But he was on the water, that's known for sure. At some point, though, he got off his boat on June 2nd. The thing is, he had scheduled a job and had to go back on shore to do it at someone's house. He had employees that were helping him. At 7:30 a.m., a worker saw him at the work site, but records put him back on the boat, making a collect call at 8:11 and 9:52. Why? You watch a lot of true crime, so you probably know many killers go back to the scene for two reasons. One, to see if they got away with it. Two, to see if the cops had come, if the investigators were there, if everything was unfolding. Or in this case, perhaps to make sure his secrets were still hidden under the dark waters of the bay. But we know they weren't. Recall the first call that came into the Coast Guard around 9:15. He was on the water when that call was made. He probably saw them taking the bodies out of the water, watching this unfold. He was on the water at 9:52. We know that the next call came in around 10 o'clock. He was still on the water, watching. We don't know if Brian Kohberger is guilty. He hasn't gone to trial yet. But his phone apparently, allegedly, pinged in the area where the murders occurred the morning after. Why? Well, maybe for the same reasons that Oba had come back to the area. If they were the killers, why else would Oba stop working and go out on the water? It's not like he was a fisherman. It took time to get back on his boat and get all the way out there. This wasn't some leisurely morning cruise on a workday. Right now, his defense attorney, Fred Zenobio, was working on the reasons his client would give. Meanwhile, the prosecutors, Bruce Bartlett, Bob Lewis, Jim Halleckson, Doug Crow, and Glenn Martin, were working against everything they thought that Zenobio would throw at them. These were seasoned attorneys, with Doug Crow being very well known as someone to fear. He could never forget one detail. He didn't even need notes. You can thank Aaron Brockovich. He knew everything about his cases and was the lead prosecutor. 5 years after the murders, he was the first to speak at the trial in September of 1994. He told the jury that they would hear evidence of all the things I've already told you thus far, and that he would prove that the 3 Rogers women were killed by Oba Chandler in the middle of the open water where no one could hear them scream, offer them help, or see who did it. So what did the defense have to say? How do you explain all these connections that the investigators had made? Well, the obvious, that Oba had met the 3 women the day that they were killed, but only to give them directions, and that the prosecution wouldn't be able to prove he ever saw them again. The defense attorney said to the jury, "It's a very straight and simple case. They have the wrong man. There is nothing more than circumstantial evidence and nothing concrete that connects Oba to the crime." He even admitted that his client met Jane, whose real name is Judy, by the way, but she wanted to remain anonymous or did not add her full name to the case. And it'll confuse you if I start using Judy, so we'll keep Jane. But yes, he admits his client took Jane out on a boat ride, but he glazed over the attack and then dropped quite a bombshell. He tells the jurors that they're going to hear all of this from Oba Chandler himself. Yeah, his client's taking the stand, and Oba was going to tell them that he didn't do this. He also added that Oba is not happy about being accused of the crimes. He didn't kill anyone. The prosecution went first, bringing in witnesses to showcase all the evidence, from the handwriting experts testifying about the brochure and the palm print, to fingerprint analysis and the calls made on the water from the boat. Even Oba's own daughter, Crystal, and her husband took the stand to tell the jury about Oba admitting that he killed these women, and also what he did to Jane. There were inmates who came forward saying that Oba had said incriminating things while waiting for trial. The worst one I heard was that he allegedly told one of the guys that he gave a woman an ultimatum on his boat. F me or swim. That's disgusting. Another thing he said was the only reason that girl's still alive is because she had a stupid friend waiting for her. Just like Jane suspected, that's really sad. He wasn't sick to his stomach because he felt bad. He was sick to his stomach because he knew he probably wasn't going to get away with this. Remember the worker who said that they saw Oba on June 2nd at 7:30? His name was Rollins Cooper. He also took the stand and said that on June 1st, remember the day that the girls got directions? On June 1st, Oba seemed to be in a hurry. He asked him, "Hey, what's going on? Why are you in a hurry?" Oba said, "I have a date with 3 women. This man is married, and he's telling this guy this. He's scum." The next morning at 7:30, Ron saw him again, and that's the day that Oba looked tired. He inquired, "Why are you so tired?" Oba said, "I was out on the boat all night." Well, on cross-examination, the defense attorney ripped into Mr. Cooper. He said, "You and Oba, you just don't like each other. You had a falling out over money, and now you just want to lie for revenge." But that's kind of an extreme lie over an argument about money. Then, of course, Jane took the stand, and it was an emotional day. The defense tried to get this testimony barred, but the evidence was crucial. It showed a pattern and was relevant to pass the legal standards to be admitted. She talked about everything we know happened, including the man sitting in the courtroom being the guy who forced her to have intercourse, and then wiped his prints from her camera after he threw her film overboard. The jurors cried. You could tell how compelling this testimony was. But the defense brought in other witnesses, people who said they saw the girls with other people, saw Joe along with some guy. Another one said they saw both of the girls at the mall with a young boy, and someone else said they actually hung out with Michelle and Christy and saw them get into a shiny black car. But the prosecution poked holes in all of these theories. The theory that someone else could have killed these girls. And then it was Oba's turn. It's not every day that the defendant takes the stand. This was huge. The courthouse was packed. It was packed every day. But this day in particular, Oba was speaking for the first time. Everyone wanted to hear it. He used a very soft-spoken tone and told the jury that yes, he ran into the Rogers women on June 1st. He had just finished a job and needed to get some gas, so he went to the local gas station off Interstate 4, close to one of the exits off the highway. When he came out of the station from getting a pack of cigarettes, he saw Michelle in the parking lot. She came up to him and asked him if he knew how to get to the Days Inn. He said he began to give her some directions to a different Days Inn, but then all of a sudden, he heard something. He turns and another young girl pokes her head out of a window of a car and corrected Michelle, stating it's the Rocky Point location. So Oba said he gave her the right directions, explaining how to get back on the highway and make their way to their destination. He said the conversation didn't take more than 2 minutes. He admitted he wrote the directions on the brochure, but he never saw any of these women again. He never took them out on his boat, and he certainly never killed them. Okay, but then why tell your buddy that you're going on a date with 3 women? Well, he says that's a lie. But could he explain away the collect calls made to his house on June 2nd in those early morning hours? He tried to. He said he was out fishing, and he got out there around 9:30 or 10 p.m. After he was done fishing, something happened to his boat. He tried to start the engine, but it just wouldn't start. He said he could smell gasoline and was looking around, but it was so dark he wasn't able to pinpoint where it could possibly be coming from. But then after using a light, he examined the engine and noticed his fuel line had ruptured. All the gas was just pouring out from this gaping hole underneath the boat, and it was everywhere, even on the boat's deck. So he tried calling his house but had no luck. He tried getting it towed, but somehow he couldn't. So he spent the night drifting at sea, and finally, when day broke, he used his shirt to flag someone down. It was a Coast Guard crew in a dinghy, but they were busy at the moment according to Oba, so they couldn't help him. He found some tape at this point and used it to cover the hole in the gas line, but it wasn't going to work anyway because he had already run out of gas. Finally, he said 2 men gave him a tow to the marina. He bought some gas, went home, and made a couple of calls to his wife that morning before he set off. His attorney asked him one last question. "Did you kill these ladies?" To which he answered, "I've never killed anyone in my whole life. It's ludicrous. It's ridiculous." Well, I think the story is ridiculous and ludicrous. I think he's pathetic, narcissistic, and a monster. He's someone who believes he's better than everyone else, smarter than everyone else, and can fool everyone around him. Well, he's wrong. Oba didn't consider that his boat would ever be examined because he got rid of it, but the state's detectives tracked that sucker down. They found the new owner and were able to purchase the boat to use as evidence. However, it wasn't until one of those investigators, named Scott Hopkins, heard Oba's testimony that he realized something. Hopkins had been one of the people on the task force examining Oba's boat. He runs up to the prosecutor and says, "I call bullcrap on Oba's statement. He's lying. All they would need was a mechanic and fast." While all this is going on, It is time for the prosecution to cross-examine Oba, and he did not go easy on him. I'm happy about that. He pressed him about each detail, starting with how many felonies he had, and Oba answered 6. He pressed him about his daughter's testimony and that of her husband's. What did Oba have to say about that? He said he didn't get a chance to provide any information to contradict her statements, to which Crow was obviously trying to rattle him and said, "Well, weren't you just on direct? Wasn't that your chance?" And Oba just sat there. You could tell he did not like to be challenged. Well, that's too bad. It was when Crow brought up the case involving Jane that he had yet to go to trial for, by the way, that Oba said, "I'm not here to talk about that trial." You could tell he was upset. Crow asked if Oba was pleading the fifth, and he said yes. Crow asked why, and Oba said, "Because you think what you're gonna say would incriminate you." Oba said no. That's when his defense attorney tried to prevent Crow from pushing forward, but the judge said it was permitted. All Crow was doing was setting Oba up for what was next. He knew something that the defense didn't know. He knew he had something to prove that Oba was a liar. Crow proceeded to ask Oba about June 1st. He wanted to know when he met the women. Oba said, "Oh, I don't recall really. Not even an estimate?" Crow pressed him and pressed him. Was it the morning? Was it the afternoon? Oba kept saying, I don't know, I don't know, I don't remember. So Crow was like, "What were you doing that you can't remember?" Then he asked him if he recognized Michelle and Christie's pictures. "Why didn't you come forward about seeing them as a witness?" Oba explained that he didn't recognize them until November when the police put up the sketch. Crow asked, "Then was kind of weird timing, don't you think? Maybe because you were staring right back at yourself?" Recall this is also when he skipped town, and recall that this sketch was done with information provided by Jane. Now, the prosecutor moved into asking Oba about his boat again, because he really wanted to make sure that the jury knew exactly what happened to Oba and how he was suggesting it happened to him that night. So, he asked him to tell it again, and Oba stated, "My 40-gallon tank was full of fuel when I left, and it leaked out at the bottom of the boat into the bay." Crow asked, "About what time did this happen?" Oba said, "I think it was 1 or 2 a.m. So Crow inquired about all those other hours. He wanted to know if Oba just sat there for 6 or 7 hours. Oba said, "Yeah, I used my light, I saw where the leak was coming from, I called home." But what about that 6 or 7 hour gap? Oba's response was, "Oh, I fell asleep." But Crow just kept pressing him. "You didn't call a friend. Why not? And why couldn't the Coast Guard help you?" Oba literally says, "I feel like he slipped up here." He said, "Oh, because they were looking for a body on the rocks." Seriously. But it's what happened next that was a turning point. Recall Oba saying how he finally got a tow, then got gas at the marina, and then called his wife to say he was on his way home. Well, those calls were at 8:11 and 9:52 a.m., but both Rollins and the woman whose house they were working on saw him at 7:30 a.m., so it doesn't add up. The prosecutor told Oba that. He said, "Did you make those calls before or after you got the tow and went home?" Oba replied, "Before." "Okay, so you were still on the boat?" "Well, yeah." "Okay, then how did you get to the job site if your boat was broken down? How'd you get there between 7:15 and 7:30, Mr. Chandler?" He was stunned. You could tell he was just caught in a lie. But of course he tried to recover by saying, "Well, I wasn't the one that said I was there at 7:30. I don't know when I got there." He really doesn't know that much, does he? At this point, Oba actually tried to get the judge to admonish Crow, the prosecutor, for what? I don't know, doing his job? And it backfired. The judge told Oba, "You need to calm down." Poor Oba, his magic wasn't working in the courtroom. The judge said that Oba should just go ahead and answer the questions, to which he responded by saying, "Well, he just gets under my skin, Judge." And I'm sitting there saying, then he's doing his job, isn't he? So Crow goes back to questioning him regarding Jane. The timeline of Oba's departure from Tampa when the sketch came out was kind of an odd timing. So what about all that? And Oba said, well, he was worried that he was going to get caught. But Crow said, weren't you worried about the connection? Isn't that what you were worried about, the connection between Jane's case and the Rogers case? And he said, no, 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 no. I figured they would find out who killed the Rogers women. And that's when Crow literally looked at him and said, well, perhaps we have Mr. Chandler. That is such a burn. This could be a movie. It should be a movie. Then everything came together. Crow handed Oba a picture of his Bayliner boat and he said, show me where the leak was. So Oba pointed to the front of the engine, but there was an issue. The gas lines in this engine come from underneath the floor. So Crow pressed him even further. He said, oh, did it come up here from the top? And then it was like, no, I can't really see the gas tank. I don't know where it's coming from, really. So, you fixed this, but you can't remember where it was leaking from? This guy that spends so much time on the water now seems to be clueless about how his own boat engine operates. Well, that's when Crow asks him if he knows what an anti-siphon valve is. It prevents the fuel line from leaking. It closes off a leak. And that's when Oba tried to argue that it only worked when a leak happened in a certain part of the engine near the pump. So now it seemed like Oba did know where all the parts were. The truth was, there was no evidence of a leak ever occurring in that fuel line at all. Oba stepped down and the defense rested. But the prosecution still had a few witnesses. One was an inmate that shared a cell with Oba. He heard him talking about the brochure. He said, my biggest mistake was leaving that note in the car. Then it was the expert mechanic James Hensley's turn to take the stand to counter Oba's argument about the fuel line. He worked on boats for over 20 years. Firstly, duct tape would never have worked. It would have dissolved. The gasoline would have just destroyed it. And next, Oba claimed that the gas leaked from the bottom of the boat. Well, guess what? The anti-siphon valve prevents that from happening, so that's a lie. And then a Coast Guard testified he was never out on the boat in an inflatable dinghy on June 2nd, especially not looking for a body on the rocks. The prosecution and defense had now both rested their cases. It was in the jury's hands. It took them 5 minutes to reach a verdict. 5. Guilty, guilty, guilty. So, what was the nail in the coffin according to the jury? It was Oba himself. And ain't that the truth? There was no reaction from him during the verdict. As for a sentence, it was death, and that death warrant was signed in October of 2011 by the governor. Chandler's last meal, in case you were wondering, was 2 salami sandwiches on white bread with mustard. And he also asked for a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. He wanted grape jelly. I liked that too on white bread, but he only ate half of that. And he ordered an iced tea, but had coffee instead. This man never had one visitor in 17 years in prison. Not one person from his family even tried to visit him. I wouldn't either. He did leave a final statement behind on the day of Oba Chandler's execution. He had a handwritten note, and he wrote, "You are killing an innocent man today." 4 years later, that would prove to be another lie that he told. A liar until the day he died. The first lethal injection was administered at 4:07 p.m. This one paralyzes the suspect. Oba just closed his eyes and fidgeted around a little bit. By 4:10, he was just laying there with his mouth hanging open. And by 4:14, the next injection was given. This is the one that stops your heart. He was pronounced dead at 4:25 p.m. So remember when the FBI profiled the Rogers family killer? The first thing they said was that he was a serial killer, and I kept thinking, well, they got that part wrong. But in 2014, detectives were working on an unsolved case in Broward County, Florida, which is where I was born. It was 20-year-old Ivelisse Barrios Bejaris. She had disappeared after leaving her job at the mall on November 20th, 1990. Later that night, she was found strangled to death. Crime scene technicians suspected this was a sexual motive, so they collected semen from her body at the scene. When they reopened this case and ran that DNA in the system, they finally got a hit. It was Oba Chandler. Wow, he had killed someone after he killed the Rogers family. I was stunned. I wasn't surprised, but just stunned. Oba Chandler lived less than a mile from the mall where she worked. The cold case detective said that they're investigating other murders that Oba Chandler may be involved in, including Terry Ann Gilchrist. She was 35 years old, and she was 35 years old, and she was found strangled just north of Wiles Road on Coral Ridge Drive in 1990 as well. but there have been no conclusive connections in that case made. Hal Rogers remarried. He was alone for a long time, but then he finally decided it was time to put an ad in the newspaper, and that's how he met his wife Jolene. She understood death. She understood loss, because she was a widow that lost her husband, and she had 4 children. They had a connection right away, and I also liked how her name was close to Joe's name. It's like Joe and Jolene. He had another chance to have a family. Of course, nothing is going to compare to who he lost. Michelle, Joe, and his favorite little Christy. Nothing is going to bring them back. And when Hal was asked how he felt in 2011, he said, "I miss them all." Hal and his brother remained estranged from each other. And in his mind, if John had never hurt Michelle, they would have never gone to Florida. He blames his brother for his family's death, but he finds peace by believing that his family is watching over him.